committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled Diversity in the Boardroom, Examining Proposals to Increase the Diversity of America's Boards. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. Today, this committee convenes for a hearing on the lack of racial, ethnic, and gender diversity on federal and corporate boards. Strong diversity in the boardroom is critical to continued U.S. competitiveness and to ensuring that consumers of all backgrounds are served and not excluded. Unfortunately, corporate and federal boards are not living up to their responsibility to reflect America's rich diversity. According to the Alliance for Board Diversity, over 80% of new board directors at Fortune 500 companies in 2017 were white males. Federal government also has a long way to go. For example, our own Federal Reserve System has been in existence since 1913, but it wasn't until 2017 that Raphael Bostic became the very first African American and first openly gay man to serve as a Federal Reserve Bank president. At the same time, America continues to become more demographically diverse. According to the 2018 census projections, youthful minorities will be the leading source of future workers, taxpayers, and consumers. In our May 1st Diversity and Inclusion Subcommittee hearing entitled Good for the Bottom Line, Reviewing the Business Case for Diversity, we set the record straight that highly inclusive companies outperform their competitors, rate themselves 170% better at innovation, and generate 1.4 times more revenue. Despite the clear benefits of inclusivity and diversity, white males still remain in the majority of seats on corporate and federal boards. Women of color, in particular, have been excluded from participation on boards. Although some reports show that the percentages of women on boards may be increasing, the raw numbers reveal that compared to white males and white women, African American, Asian, and Latino women still have the fewest seats. In order to understand these trends, we must continue to have access to board diversity data. Diversity is one of the best investments a company can make. Diverse boards help intentionally guide companies and industry toward business solutions that maximize returns on that diversity investment. Before us today are witnesses who can share perspectives on the status of board demographics. I look forward to drilling down on the current state of board diversity and discussing solutions so that more women and minorities can be appointed to board seats. I now recognize the ranking member of the committee, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry, for 2 minutes for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chairwoman Waters. Thank you for your leadership on this very important issue. And I want to start by thanking the ranking member on the Subcommittee on Diversity and Inclusion, Ms. Wagner, for all of her work. She and her colleagues on the subcommittee have spent a great deal of time gathering information about diversity and inclusion in our jurisdiction. I also want to commend Chairwoman Waters and Chairwoman Beatty for their leadership on these issues as well. It's extremely important to increase the diversity and inclusion on American boardrooms. Pursuing more diverse boards is the right thing to do as a matter of economic interest for these institutions. But there's also a good reason for corporate leaders to prioritize diversity. Research shows when you have a more diverse array of inputs, you actually get better outcomes. Wider experience and perspectives actually lead to better decision-making and risk management. The statistics show women and minorities continue to be underrepresented, though. Women and minorities only hold approximately 38% of board positions at America's top 100 companies. While we've made progress, Progress does not mean we've arrived. Progress does not mean we have completed the job. We have a lot more work to do in order to ensure that we have diverse boardrooms and diverse decision-making at the top level and at all levels of corporate America. We're fortunate today to have witnesses who can share the strategies that have been effective. Nominating committees cannot simply rely on a pile of resumes from C-suite social networks and personal relationships. Recruiting more diverse board members is only part of the challenge. Dr. Stephanie Creary, who is testifying today, interviewed board directors across a variety of industries and found that the board's culture is also critically important. I look forward to hearing about Dr. Creary's research today and hearing from this distinguished panel. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize the chair of the Subcommittee on Diversity and Inclusion, Ms. Beatty, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters, for examining diversity in the boardroom. It is simple. Americans' boards should be more representative of our rich, diverse culture. According to research, greater diversity in leadership leads to better profitability, more financial stability, and creates better gains for shareholders. It is in that spirit that I am honored to have this point of personal privilege to introduce a good friend of mine, but more importantly, Skip Spriggs III, President and CEO of the powerful Executive Leadership Council, who is here today with his colleagues. His organization of some 300 Fortune 1000 companies leads the efforts to increase the number of global Black executives in C-suites and on corporate boards. We are honored that he and his colleagues have pledged their support to help us with this movement. It is with that I yield back, and thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you very much. I recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentlewoman from Missouri, Ms. Wagner.
Thank you, Ranking Member McHenry, and thank you, Chairwoman Waters, for holding this hearing today. Chairwoman Beatty and I have been speaking with many experts versed in these issues and are proud of the steps that financial services leaders are taking to ensure workforces are more diverse and inclusive. Many of the most successful corporations in the financial sector and throughout the economy are proactively seeking to improve the diversity of their workforce. It is the right thing to do and a highly effective way to increase innovation and profitability. Studies continue to show that diverse corporations outperform their less diverse competitors. We must continue to treat diversity and inclusion as complementary but separate issues. Although a company may be able to increase recruitment, it is also critically important to focus efforts on making sure an environment is inclusive for retention purposes. More can be done in both areas, but it is encouraging to see that more corporations are taking on this mission. Efforts to diversify should include entry-level positions all the way through executive and director-level positions. My goal today will be to identify the conditions that lead to meaningful diversity and uncover best practices so more companies can follow the lead of the firms that have already been successful on this front. I look forward to hearing about strategies for improving diversity and inclusion, and I am proud, very proud of this committee for examining these very important issues. I welcome our witnesses, one and all, and look forward to their testimony. I thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome today's distinguished panel. Ms. Chelsea Gherkin, Acting Director, Education, Workforce, and Income Security Team, U.S. Government Accountability Office. Mr. Luke Visconti, Founder and Chairman, Diversity Incorporated. Mr. Ron Lumbra, Managing Partner, Hendrick and Struggles. Ms. Linda Akutagua, Chair, Alliance for Board Diversity. Ambassador Vilma Martinez, who represented the United States in Argentina from 2009 to 2013 and has served on numerous corporate boards and public commissions. Dr. Stephanie Creary, Assistant Professor of Management, Wharton School of Business, University of Pennsylvania. Without objection, all of your written statements will be made part of the record. Each of you will have 5 minutes to summarize your testimony. When you have 1 minute remaining, a yellow light will appear. At that time, I would ask you to wrap up your testimony so we can be respectful of both the witnesses and the committee members' time. Ms. Gherkin, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to share GAO's work on strategies to increase diversity on boards of directors. Over the years, GAO has worked with the Financial Services Committee to share information on progress for minorities and women in the financial services industry. I look forward to continuing to work with you and with today's witnesses to address the challenges to increasing board diversity and identify strategies to boost representation. Boards of directors make decisions that affect the lives of millions of employees and consumers and influence the policies and practices of the global marketplace. Research suggests that diversity in the workplace can help organizations better identify and address risks, provide innovative solutions to complex problems, and enhance the quality of decision-making and monitoring. My statement today draws primarily from 2 key GAO reports on board diversity. One of the reports examined the representation of women on corporate boards, and the other examined the representation of women and minorities on the Federal Home Loan Bank boards. I will discuss the challenges we found that contribute to fewer women and minorities on corporate and Federal Home Loan Bank boards, and the strategies that we identified to address them. It is well known that women and minorities have fewer seats at the table when some of the most important decisions are being made in corporate America. Our analysis in 2015 of corporate boards found that while women's representation on corporate boards had increased, it would likely take decades before women and men had an equal number of seats in America's boardrooms. We also found that while the share of women on the 11 Federal Home Loan Bank boards across the country increased from 2015 to 2018, women still comprise less than 1/4 of all of those directors. We found a similar increase in the number of Federal Home Loan Bank directors from minority groups, including African American, Hispanic, and Asian, but they also made up only a small portion of all board seats. To understand these trends and to identify what can be done to increase the representation of women and minorities on boards, we spoke with industry representatives, board members, and with other stakeholders. We found 3 key barriers to increasing board diversity and a number of strategies that could help overcome them. First, organizations were not always prioritizing diversity in their board recruiting efforts. Second, organizations looked to the traditional CEO pipeline for potential board candidates, often overlooking other talent pools of potentially qualified directors. And third, few board seats open up each year. For each of these 3 broad challenges, we identified a number of strategies that could address them. And along the way, we heard from industry representatives and others that there was no one silver bullet, no one-size-fits-all solution to these challenges. They said boards should pursue diversity using whichever strategies best suit their organization. While industry officials we spoke with generally agreed on the potential benefits of having more diverse boards, they also identified some advantages and disadvantages to the specific strategies discussed today. However, despite the strategy employed, stakeholders generally agreed that without an intentional and deliberate commitment to increasing diversity, increased representation on boards would remain slow. Among the strategies we identified was that boards could prioritize diversity by requiring a diverse slate of candidates anytime a board position became available. For example, a slate would have to include a number of women for consideration. Boards could look beyond their traditional CEO candidates and recruit talent from other senior-level positions, for example, accounting or legal executives, or from other institutions like academia. And boards could consider increasing their size, either permanently or temporarily, to overlap with long-tenured board members or as a tool for succession planning, and to create more opportunities for women and minorities to join. Many stakeholders we interviewed supported improving disclosure requirements to include more specific information on board diversity. These disclosures not only increased the transparency, but they demonstrated the board's commitment to diversity to their investors and to the public. I look forward to further discussing strategies to increase board diversity. This concludes my remarks, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Visconti, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Good morning, Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify. I am Luke Visconti, founder and chairman of Diversity, Inc. I stepped aside as CEO on May 7th of this year. Carolyn Johnson, our CEO, asked me to provide today's testimony. She's with us here today. Diversity, Inc. is a business publication dedicated to the business benefits of diversity. The cornerstone of our publication is the annual Top 50 Companies for Diversity competition. Diversity is commonly seen as an issue concerning everyone but white men. This is erroneous. Diversity is a concern of every American because our destiny is shared by all. Professor Steve Phillips, author of Brown is the New White, recently wrote that, quote, there are 7,000 more people of color added to the U.S. population every single day as compared to just 1,000 whites through a combination of births, deaths, and legal immigration, unquote. From a business perspective, diversity is an issue of profitability, ethical corporate governance, and for publicly traded companies, return on equity. It is not an issue for the future, it is an urgent issue of today. A lack of diversity on corporate boards of directors is an ongoing and persistent problem across all industries, but in the banking industry has an especially deleterious effect in our country, holding back our national GDP by denying equal access to finance, and as a result of poor workforce diversity, thwarting innovation and the talent needed to compete. We have been conducting our Top 50 competition for 18 years. It is voluntary and open to any company with more than 1,000 employees. There is no cost to compete, and results have no association with business conducted with our company. Thousands of companies look at our survey every year, hundreds complete it. The survey takes a deep look at human capital performance and governance, including supplier diversity. The survey has 1,200 fields of data, including boards of directors, top 4 levels of management, total workforce, and the best practices statistically associated with superior human capital results. There are 5 banks on our 2019 Top 50 list: Wells Fargo at 13, TD Bank at 19, Key Bank at 36, HSBC at 40, and US Bank at 46. We do not disclose the companies who compete but do not rank. However, we do not provide anonymity to companies who choose not to compete. Wells Fargo and TD are the only top 10 largest banks in this US that compete for a spot on the top 50. JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, PNC, and Capital One do not fill out a survey and bother to compete. In contrast, heavily regulated companies such as AT&T, EY, PwC, Comcast, Abbott, Eli Lilly, MasterCard, and TIAA are all in the top 15 of our list. On the boards of the 10 largest U.S. banks, 30% of directors are women and 22% are not white. This is better than the average for Fortune 500 companies, which is 16% women and 23% not white, but far worse than the diversity in top 10, 30% women and 34% not white. It's important to note, however, that for people the age range of directors, more than half of 4-year degrees were earned by women, and today, more women than men earn 4-year degrees, master's degrees, and PhDs. There are several diversity management best practices that we have measured to be associated with superior results. The only one appropriate for board of directors purview is an executive diversity committee, or EDC. In the top 10 companies on our list, 86.7%, and the top 10 includes 6 companies which were previously number 1 on our list. 86.7% of the top 10 companies have a CEO chairing the committee, and it meets monthly. And if you consider that meetings focus on metrics-driven results and the accountability of diversity management efforts, particularly regarding advancement and retention of non-majority groups, especially high-potential people, this is why they're on the top 10 of our list. Their results bear out the attention to detail that the CEOs provide. This would be an easy report out to a board, and standardized could be included in the EEO1 report, which would make everybody equal on that regard in terms of measurement. However, the board has to be competent to understand the diversity report. Unfortunately, boards of financial institutions are not competent in managing their own diversity. The progress of everyone not white and male in banking, executive leadership, and board seats is too slow to leave to non-accountable techniques, in my opinion. For example, the Rooney Rule was established in the NFL in 2003, but the NFL is still a plantation. 88% of head coaches, 97% of owners are white, and only 30% of players are white. Fair access to capital is an essential competitive advantage for our country, and it will remain an aspiration until boards of directors develop the discipline to have fair representation themselves. The lack of transparency in the process of selecting board members and of the data in general is a real hindrance, and I recommend that regulation be implemented.
Mr. Lumber, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and members of the committee for this opportunity to speak with you today and provide remarks on this important topic. My name is Ron Lumbra. I'm Managing Partner for Centers of Excellence and partner in the board and CEO practice at Heidrick & Struggles. I'm in New York. We're a global executive search firm that advises companies around the globe on leadership, on board succession, on leadership development and succession. I've had the privilege of being in the executive search business for 21 years, and I've had the privilege to advise boards throughout the economy in various industries on board succession and board recruitment. Over this period, I've seen a number of trends emerge. The biggest one, the most prominent one we're currently facing is diversity in the boardroom. It's a hot topic that companies are acting on and calling us to act on with them. In 2019, our U.S. Board Monitor, which is a survey we do that talks about director trends in the Fortune 500, was just published. We saw that women last year, 2018, filled 40% of new board seats. That's double from a decade ago. Minorities filled 23% of new board seats, up from 14% in 2009. Despite this recent progress and gains, however, the total share of minority and female directors on boards is still quite low. According to a 2018 report from Deloitte and the Alliance for Board Diversity, from 2010 to 2018, the percentage of women on boards only moved from 16 to 22.5%. The movement of minorities on boards only moved from 13 to 16% in that nearly decade period. Progress has been slow, as you can see. We've observed a few key obstacles that are standing in the way in progress of diversity on corporate boards. First, as was mentioned previously, low turnover. Most directors who serve on corporate boards serve on the board for more than a decade. Turnover is slow. On average, companies only add a director approximately every 18 months. For example, in the Fortune 500, over the last decade, in any particular year, about 2/3 of companies would add a director. Give you a sense of the velocity of how new directors come on corporate boards. Demand for CEO experience. It is a key attribute that boards look for. There's reasons for that. Having a strategic perspective matters. Having a CEO perspective matters. However, we understand that the pool of Fortune 500 CEOs is not a particularly diverse pool. So concentrating on that pool, by definition, has you looking at the non-diverse population to join corporate boards. Board culture. Culture matters. Typically, boards like to bring on people that they can get familiar with quickly, who are often in their networks, known to them, or easily referenced or introduced through their networks. That makes it very difficult if those networks don't happen to be diverse. So those are three inhibitors that we see that are fairly universal in slowing the trend to bringing diverse talent onto corporate boards. Despite these challenges, I've talked about some progress that's been made recently, and that progress continues. Here are some of the things that are helping. First and foremost, board assessment. Rather than waiting for terms to expire for directors to retire, best-run boards are looking carefully at their constituencies, looking at, are we bringing the best skill set for the challenges and the strategy the board is facing at the moment, or could we do better? And they're moving off directors whose skill sets no longer fit, bringing on new contemporary directors. Those new directors are often diverse. In addition, best boards expand opportunistically. Although some boards have been shrinking in size, boards that see great diverse talent will occasionally expand in order to capture diverse talent and bring it on. That's been a best practice. Casting a wider net is a critical factor. Rather than looking in the networks that all exist, looking at the CE network, looking at business unit heads, division heads, P&L leaders, considering people from academia, former government officials, former military veterans, provides a much broader, more diverse pool to look at. And best clients, best companies are now doing that, looking at diverse pools. Having a disciplined process-oriented approach, being intentional about the desire for diversity on boards. Companies that have the discipline to follow a process and not jump at the first person they see that they might know have more success bringing on diversity than others. It requires patience, it requires discipline. Last year at Heidrick & Struggles, 57% of our board placements, 57% were diverse. That tells you it can happen. Boards can bring on diverse talent. If you cast a wide net, are disciplined, and look in new areas, you have the ability to do it. That's been proven. It's our belief that that will continue. This is a passion for me. Thank you for the opportunity to share these remarks with you today.
Thank you very much. Ms. Akutagawa, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Thank you. Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before the committee today on behalf of diversity in the boardroom. My name is Linda Akutagawa, and it's my honor to be here in my dual roles as President and CEO of LEAP, Leadership Education for Asian Pacifics, a national nonprofit organization dedicated to developing, growing, and uncapping the talent of Asian and Pacific Islander leaders, and as the chair of the Alliance for Board Diversity, a collaboration of 4 leadership organizations working together to increase the representation of women and minorities on corporate boards. LEAP, together with Catalyst, the Executive Leadership Council, and the Hispanic Association on Corporate Responsibility are the partner members of the ABD, along with our advisor, Diversified Search, and our report partner, Deloitte. Individually, our organizations are advocates for our communities, and we provide programming from board preparation, sponsorship, research, and referral that is uniquely tailored to the needs of our constituencies. 15 years ago, we formed the Alliance for Board Diversity as a means of combining our collective strengths to better address our common goal. There is a saying that you may be familiar with: what gets measured gets done. Our Missing Pieces report, the Board Diversity Census of Women and Minorities on Fortune 500 boards, shines the spotlight on the fact-based board census numbers to dispel misunderstandings and misconceptions. In addition to our research, we also collectively identify and refer diverse candidates for board opportunities, because while the numbers tell a significant story, we know it's not enough. From 2016 to 2018, the total number of available corporate board seats increased by 230. That's good news. The pie is slightly larger, and that has enabled women and minorities to go from sharing a sliver of the pie to sharing a slice. It is nice to have more than one bite. Before we cheer, though, advancement does continue to be slow, and corporate boards are still not fully reflective of the changing demographics. In disaggregating the women and minority data, you'll see that African Americans grew fastest in the Fortune 100. Asian Americans grew fastest in the Fortune 500, and Hispanics grew least overall. I also offer this caveat for context. On the Fortune 100, African American women grew by what seems like a whopping 44.8%, but that in raw numbers was only 13 seats. For Asian American women, a 38.6% increase in the Fortune 500 and 30.8% growth rate in the Fortune 100 may seem like progress. But in the Fortune 100, the raw number is really only 4 seats. For Asian Americans, the starting number was small to begin with, so any growth will seem significant. And despite being one of the fastest growing populations, Hispanic women experienced the smallest number of board appointments from 2016 to 2018. A noteworthy indicator is the recycle rate, or the rate at which individuals are serving on more than one board. The higher the number, the more boards a person sits on. Fortune 100 boards were better at seeking out unique directors versus recycling the same director. African American men, however, had the highest recycle rate among Fortune 500 board members, and Hispanic women have the highest recycle rates among Fortune 100 board members. Interestingly, Asian Americans have the lowest recycle rates on both Fortune 500 and Fortune 100 boards. But remember, Asian Americans still only occupy 4% or less than 4% of total board seats. On a closing note, There is a bright spot for optimism. In 2018, there were 35 Fortune 500 companies, up from 29 in 2016, that had at least one director from each of the 4 major racial ethnic groups and at least one female director. Diversity works, it matters, but supporters, policymakers, and advocates like us need to stay aware to ensure that we and the boards don't get complacent. With each census, we get a better lay of the land. We know the gaps and where to keep strengthening. Our great nation needs the best that all of our diverse communities can bring to the boardrooms. Thank you for inviting me today. I look forward to answering any of your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Akutagawa. Ambassador Martinez, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Committee, I thank you for this invitation and the opportunity to provide the views of the Latino Corporate Directors Association at today's hearing. I'm Vilma Martinez and pleased to present my views and the summary of LCDA's full statement submitted to your committee. I want to thank LCDA's Board Chair Roel Campos, Founding Chair Patricia Salas Pineda, and CEO Esther Aliguera for their contributions. As you noted, I'm the former U.S. Ambassador to Argentina, the first woman to represent our country in that post. I also had the privilege of serving as a director on the boards of Anheuser-Busch Companies, Fluor Corporation, Burlington Northern Santa Fe Corporation, as well as San Juan Bank, California Bank of the West, and the U.S. Board of Shell Oil Company. LCDA is comprised of U.S. Latinos who serve on publicly traded and large private company boards, along with C-suite executives and board-qualified candidates. Our mission is to support Latino directors, develop the next wave of Latina directors, and increase their numbers serving on corporate boards. We thank you and the committee for providing a forum to have this important conversation. As you know, our duties as directors are to add shareholder value and promote good governance as we strive for healthy, sustainable, long-term corporate growth. Today, U.S. Latinos total nearly 59 million, or 18% of the U.S. population, and are projected to add on average over 1.2 million people a year between 2017 and 2060. We account for the vast majority of the growth in the U.S. workforce. 74% of the 10.5 million workers projected to be added to the U.S. labor force from 2010 to 2020 will be Latino. The U.S. Latino gross domestic product is $2.13 trillion and is on a par to grow $80 to $90 billion a year. An additional good news side, Latino entrepreneurs are driving job creation and economic growth. There are 4 million Latino-owned businesses that together contribute in excess of $660 billion to the American economy. Unfortunately, despite a strong talent pool, Latinos and Latinas are the least represented on America's corporate boards. Based on our analysis of new data released today on boardroom demographics, women, racial, and ethnic groups continue to lag, with Latinos falling far behind. As part of LCDA's and my statements, we have released a comprehensive table based on data compiled by ISS Analytics on board composition of S&P 1,500 companies, comparing the 2019 statistics to 2008. In summary, the data demonstrate that over the last 10 years, gender diversity on corporate board has increased by about 11%, with more room to go. But at the same time, the rate for board diversity has been much slower for communities of color, with an increase of 3.12 percentage points. By all measures, Latinos and Latinas are woefully underrepresented. In 2019, Latinos overall held only 2.28% of these board seats, an increase of just 0.56 percentage points from 2008. Latinas represented only less than 0.5% of board seats. And this despite the growing body of research which has been testified to today, demonstrating the correlation between board diversity and positive corporate financial performance. Disclosure and transparency on the diversity composition of boards is an important step to advance board diversity. Disclosure of this information helps investors and shareholders make informed investment decisions, since board composition is an important component of good corporate governance. So for this reason, LCDA endorses the Improving Corporate Governance Through Diversity Act, which would require public companies to disclose data based on self-identification of the racial, ethnic, and gender composition of their boards of directors, nominees for the boards, and corporate officers. In summary, LCDA seeks to be a part of the solution to close this underrepresentation gap of U.S. Latinos on corporate boards. Ultimately, greater boardroom diversity that includes Latinos is an integral component to accelerating the growth potential of our U.S. companies. LCDA and I stand ready to be a resource to help advance these efforts. We appreciate your consideration of these views. Thank you again for your consideration of this issue and the time today.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Martinez. Dr. Creary, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and members of the committee for this opportunity to testify today. My name is Stephanie Creary, and I'm an assistant professor of management at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. I will focus on sharing excerpts from an article published on March 27, 2019 by Harvard Business Review, highlighting some of the findings from my recent research on corporate board diversity and board culture. Based on interviews with 19 board directors who held seats on 47 corporate boards in the United States across a variety of industries, my colleagues and I found that diversity doesn't guarantee a better performing board and firm. Rather, the culture of the board is what can affect how well diverse boards perform their duties and oversee their firms. Specifically, we found that board diversity matters, but concentrating on only one form of diversity isn't enough. Our interviewees suggested that social diversity, for example, gender, race, ethnicity, and age diversity, and professional diversity are both important for increasing the diversity of perspectives represented on the board. Many of our interviewees suggested that their boards had made progress on gender diversity, but not on other forms of diversity, such as race, nationality, and age. They also raised concerns with what they referred to as checking the box initiatives and tokenism for the sake of board diversity. One interviewer revealed how she turned down a board position because she felt that the interviewing board members were not able to comment on her expertise, only their desire to have gender diversity on the board. She shared, "I can understand what it means to be a token person. I don't like that. I said, if you only think my value is the fact that I am a female, I can't add value to your board." To offset these concerns, some boards are ensuring that skills and expertise, along with demographics, are front and center in their recruiting processes. One board member shared, "We look at diversity in a lot of different ways: experience, age, ethnicity, and gender." Many boards are also broadening the range of professional backgrounds considered for board member positions, allowing them to attract more socially diverse directors. This is easier to achieve when boards avoid filling open seats with people already in their personal and professional networks. One interviewee's current boards are shifting to a different approach, a process of assessment where the board periodically looks at the skill sets that they would ideally want on the board, given the business the firm is in, and then the skill sets that are represented on the board, and then identifying any missing. So as long as they're going to look for a new board member, they use it as an opportunity to build diversity. It is also important to consider recruiting from outside of the CEO and CFO pool to increase board diversity. One interviewee commented on how having social diversity wasn't good enough if all board members were former CEOs or CFOs. She said, "Having board members that come from a different background is really good, such as Chief Information, Chief Technology, and Chief Human Resource Officers. My colleagues and I also found that diversity doesn't matter as much on boards where members' perspectives are not regularly elicited or valued. Some boards are more hierarchical in their communication orientation, while others are more egalitarian. These dynamics appear to shape whether diversity on the board actually matters to the board's work. On more hierarchical boards, the CEO, chairman, or lead independent director tends to dominate board meetings. In contrast, more egalitarian boards have a more collegial board culture. One interview explained that their collegial board culture resulted from information being shared openly with little back-channeling or meeting outside of the formal meeting to raise concerns. Collegial boards are more likely to accept and integrate differences of opinion. Members of these boards believe that both their expertise and willingness to learn is recognized and incorporated into the board's work. Interestingly, several interviewees told us that boards that value open communication are more likely to engage in conversations about diversity. One interviewee commented on how longer-term board members still struggled to understand the value of diversity. Another explained raising issues around diversity in the leadership pipeline and his desire to make this a higher board priority. He said, "One of our board members who was African American came up to me after I raised this issue and said, 'Thank you for bringing this topic up, because I brought it up years ago, not so delicately, and nothing ever happened.' So he said, 'Maybe if we get more of us board members looking at this issue, it'll move the needle.'" In closing, it is clear from this research that the benefits of having a socially and professionally diverse board cannot be realized without an egalitarian board culture where different perspectives are regularly elicited and integrated into the board's work. Therefore, I encourage the committee to consider not only how to increase board diversity, but also how to create more inclusive boards. I thank the committee for considering these important issues.
Thank you very much. I'd like to go on to raising some witness questions. The first thing that I'd like to talk about, or the question I'd like to ask, is about what we hear so much about from corporations and federal agencies, that they are taking steps to expand their recruitment efforts more deeply into diverse communities such as HBCUs and affinity groups. We also know that the talent is out there, but these efforts alone may not be enough. Can any of you, starting with Ms. Gherkin and going right a few minutes that we have, tell me what you think can be done to improve recruitment, because we hear so much, well, we're interested, but we can't find the talent. Ms. Gherkin, have you heard that?
Yes, that was actually one of the key challenges that we heard, was that they were relying on their personal, board members relied on their personal networks or on the CEO position to identify new talent. Some of the strategies that we heard from our industry stakeholders, however, were that there were a lot of potential talented board members out there if they were willing to look in other professions. Someone mentioned the Chief Human Resources Officer, or in the Chief Technology, or even looking at, supply chain logistics experts that are retired military.
Okay, Ms. Visconti, what about you? What can be done to dispel this argument that we can't find any of them?
Well, the talent hasn't been treated very well in corporate America. It has failed to be promoted and recognized to reach the levels where people are considered for boards of directors. So we have to look a little bit lower than what's traditionally in terms of hierarchy, in terms of where we normally select board members. They're there, there's plenty of talent, has to be looked at differently. Thank you. Dr. Curry, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes, I think one of the biggest issues that we found was that there weren't established criteria other than needing a CEO or a CFO in order to take a board position or in order to recruit for a board position. And when prompted, there wasn't consensus around why a CEO or a CFO was actually needed. And there's a long history of research established, both in academia and in the practical sector, that the criteria are too narrow and they're not necessarily objective. So I think by focusing on what are the criteria, some of these issues around who's talented and who should be represented will go away.
Mr. Lumbrough?
A disciplined process works very well. Defining what a board truly needs in terms of the skill set and then having the discipline to look for that kind of person will often yield diverse results rather than someone who's already known and easy to find.
Ms. Achikawa?
I'm going to add that looking to some of the non-traditional sources for potential candidates is another opportunity to expand that or cast that wider net. I think that there are organizations like the Alliance for Board Diversity Members who do have access to a wide array of very qualified, diverse leaders who can step up into these board roles.
Yes, Ambassador Martinez?
Yes, if I could just reiterate some of the comments that were already made, such as require a diverse slate of candidates. The board assessment process that Mr. Lumbrough spoke about is very effective in articulating what this particular board might need at any point in time and casting that wide net beyond the friends of people already on corporate boards.
Thank you. It seems that we can find qualified people serving as presidents of colleges and universities, and we seem to have more minorities who have achieved that level of representation. So why aren't we getting more from colleges and universities? Mr. Lumbrough?
I had the privilege of co-heading a presidential search committee for a university president recently, and I was stunned at the amount of diversity that showed up in the candidate pool. There are truly numbers of diverse executives, diverse talent in academia. I think one of the challenges and one of the differences between that world and the corporate world is the demand on campus. In the campus community, there's a demand, a natural latent demand for diversity, so it's top of mind. No one needs to be convinced of that, and that was apparent. It's a little different in the corporate world. The intentionality in the corporate world needs to be more disciplined and planful.
Mr. Visconti?
Discipline is key, and right now the process is not disciplined. And if it were disciplined, you would see different results. There is an acceptance of the bad results over and over and over again, which is why I think regulation needs to be put in place.
So is this an area that you think we can all do more in making sure that we develop databases, that we are able to identify people, refer people, et cetera? All right, thank you very much. The gentleman from North Carolina, Ranking Member, Mr. McHenry, is recognized for 5 minutes.
So, Dr. Creary, your research goes a level deeper than race, ethnicity, gender, right? So what is the practical effect? So the discussion here in Congress is largely about that. Your research is the level deeper, which is simply having a threshold question of diversity is only one layer of this conversation. Not that it's meaningless or more meaningful, but that's a separate question. But then it's the practical effect. So having a diverse board does not actually mean you have diverse thought when you have those metrics of diversity. What you're saying is they could all be former CFOs and CEOs, which actually doesn't give you a diversity of experience either. So go that next level deeper about what do you do for a board to ensure that there's that openness? You said egalitarian, but you get in and you say, I can actually share my perspective without it being a meaningful relationship, not a brittle relationship. So you can go in and have a strong perspective and you get a better outcome from that. Walk me through that, because this is a much deeper layer than the conversation that we've been accustomed to.
Yes, thank you. I think the first place to start is what makes a high-functioning or an effective board. And so what my research has shown is that effective boards are boards where the members are actually utilized for the skill sets for which they're recruited. But what we see time and time again is the person who's in the lead, whether that's the chairperson, the CEO, or the lead director, is dominating the board meeting. So the other 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 board members are actually not contributing much to what we think might be happening. So if you start with that as the crux of the issue, then we add diversity on top of that. You can add any form of diversity, professional diversity, race, gender, ethnicity. If that board is not eliciting any perspectives, it's not going to matter. So the issue becomes changing board dynamics so that it actually utilizes the expertise of the people on the board. The issue of which type of diversity, I think...
this is my question. Okay, thanks.
So the issue of which type of diversity is helpful is, I think, an issue that many of the boards aren't wrestling with so much as they want to begin to understand whether diversity actually can help. They recognize that different types of diversity may play different roles. So race, ethnicity, and gender, social forms of diversity, help to connect to a wider market base. It's representative of the people in the economy. A professionally diverse board can bring different ideas about how the strategy should unfold in the company. So those are the complexities that we're wrestling with.
But you also get into this really more of the behavioral piece, which is you have a diverse board on paper, and but they're not functionally diverse, right? Meaning you go in, the chair, it dominates the board, and it doesn't matter that you have these metrics of diversity because you may not have diversity of thought or a willingness to actually say object, right? So that is a deeper level of conversation. So let me ask on this question, within your research, is there a threshold by which people are more willing to speak up? Meaning, I've seen in other research, other behavioral research, that simply having a woman in the meeting with 15 other men actually doesn't mean that you have an empowered woman. there's a threshold question here by which you then have women willing to speak up as an example. Is that consistent with your research on boards?
Yes, so I would say there's the side of the equation that's about if we have a critical mass of people who are willing to push on the chairman, the CEO, or the lead director, then voices will be heard. But in all actuality, it really is the competency and the willingness of that person in the lead seat to actually ask people what it is that what they believe. So even if there's only one woman or one African American on the board, if we actually have a chairperson who goes around the table and elicits perspectives, that one voice can be powerful.
Right. So recruiting based off of race and ethnicity alone is not sufficient for empowered boards. We need to have diverse candidates that are well qualified and diverse thoughts, diverse experience, and it's a multi-layered effect is one of the takeaways.
So certainly, board dynamics are critical.
A part of the takeaway.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
The gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Maloney, Chair of the Subcommittee on Investor Protection, Entrepreneurship, and Capital Markets, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chairwoman. I thank you and the ranking member and all of the panelists today for holding this important hearing, which will address a bill, H.R. 3279, which I've introduced for the past several Congresses, the Diversity in Corporate Leadership Act. Back in 2015, I asked the Government Accountability Office to look at the gender makeup of corporate boards, and the result of this study convinced me that we need to do much, much more. Women make up 47% of the workforce in America, yet they hold only 21% of board seats at S&P 500 companies. The most startling finding in the GAO report was how long they project it will take to achieve gender parity on corporate boards. They found that even if we assume that equal proportions of women and men started joining boards right now, it would take more than 40 years for there to be an equal number. So clearly something needs to change. And let's be clear, increasing diversity on corporate boards is not just a social issue. Studies show that it's very, very good for business. Study after study has shown that companies with greater gender, racial, and ethnic diversity on the boards outperform other companies financially. McKinsey found that companies with the highest racial diversity on their boards were 33% more likely to have above average profits. And a study by Credit Suisse found that companies with at least one woman on the board, just one, outperformed their competitors by at least 3.5% a year for the last decade. With these kinds of numbers, investors actually want the companies they invest in to increase the diversity of their boards. And actually, I introduced the legislation and the GAO study at the request of investors, pension fund investors, others that want to know this information because their clients and they want to invest in diverse boards. My bill would help investors accomplish this by requiring public companies to report the gender, racial, and ethnic composition of their boards in their annual proxy statements. The GAO found that this one very simple metric is actually very, very important to investors. And by putting this information in one place that is easily accessible without requiring them to go look at pictures of board members or guess the gender, race, or ethnicity of board members based on their names, the bill would enable investors to quickly sort the companies that do and do not have diverse boards. And my bill would also establish a diversity advisory group at the SEC, which would support best strategies, best practices to increase gender, racial, and ethnic diversity on corporate boards annually. My bill would not be burdensome on companies. I work closely with the business community on this bill, and it's supported actually by the Chamber of Commerce and many other businesses. I'd like to put in the record letters from the Chamber of Commerce, CalPERS, without objection, Catalyst, LPL Financial, just to name a few.
Without objection, such
And
is the order.
I have one brief question, if I have time for a question. I wanted to go down the line and ask all the witnesses, do you think requiring companies to disclose the gender, racial, and ethnic diversity of their boards to their investors every year would help investors make more informed and better decisions and would enable investors to put more pressure on companies to improve the diversity of their boards? Because of time, just a yes and no answer, and submit in writing any other ideas you have on this question. First, Mrs. Gherkin, yes or no?
Yes.
Okay, Mr. Visconti?
Yes.
Mr. Lambra?
Yes.
Ms. Akuagawa? Am I close?
Akutagawa.
Akukagawa.
Yes. Yes and yes.
Yes and yes. Okay, Ms. Martinez?
Yes.
And Dr. Creary?
Yes.
Well, I think it's a unanimous. We need to pass this legislation. We need to get more diverse boards. It's good for the economy. It's good for the country. It's the right thing to do. It's taken us a long time to get to this point, and I want to congratulate the chairlady for having a hearing on this important issue. I've been trying for well over 10 years to get a hearing on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The gentlewoman from Missouri, Ms. Wagner, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Dr. Creary, who's testifying today, and by the way, I am just overwhelmed by your expertise and the research that you have done. She found that diversity in the boardroom leads to better outcomes when the board's cultures, as we've been talking about, is such that all directors, in fact, starting at the top, are empowered to engage and apply their experiences. In her study, she states that, and I want to quote this because I found this to be something that I just totally agreed with. I quote, "To make diverse boards more effective, boards need to have more egalitarian culture, one that elevates different voices, integrates contrasting insights, and welcomes conversations about diversity," welcomes conversations, encourages conversations about diversity. I couldn't agree more, Dr. Creary. Dr. Creary has also identified numerous companies that have broadened their candidate pool to increase boardroom diversity and enjoyed all the advantages that come with a diverse board. Dr. Creary, we have seen laws enacted in other countries, such as Norway, Spain, France, and Iceland, that require that women comprise at least 40% of boards at publicly listed companies. Can you describe the effects of some of those laws with respect to the culture of the board, ma'am?
So that's unclear. We've had quite a few studies in both academia and the practical arena looking just at the direct relationship between diversity and performance. What we have not been doing, which is what my study hopes to contribute, is examining what is actually going on in the boardroom to help us understand whether, under what conditions, the diversity might matter. So it's still an open question as to what getting us to 40% women actually does to change the board's ability to do the work that it does.
In your research, can you tell yet, do you believe that these laws have created an environment where diversity of ideas can flourish, or is that unclear yet?
It's unclear because what we haven't accounted for is the type of board. So the reason why in the research we specify hierarchical versus egalitarian is because it gives us one dimension to think about. So the idea would be if we're looking at egalitarian boards that are 40% diverse in some capacity, we would imagine that those would be the boards that would actually be performing better and contributing to firm performance. But because we don't know whether these are hierarchical or egalitarian, we can't measure that, it's hard to make sense of the findings.
What policy initiatives can we develop to bring greater transparency into women and minorities being represented on corporate boards while not creating a burdensome and costly disclosure process?
Well, while I think it's important to make the numbers known, because anytime we can acknowledge that there in fact is an issue, it actually motivates people to begin to solve it. I think we have to continue to dig deeper. It's, from my perspective as an academic, it's hard for me to speak as to what policies, particularly at the governmental level, might be helpful, but I can speak to what policies at the board level might be helpful. And that is actually for the board to implement policies that speak to utilizing the skill sets that are there. How do they begin to engage? How do you use your board members most effectively is really the important issue here.
How many companies cast a wider, or I should say, how can companies cast a wider net to identify applicants with diverse backgrounds and experiences, do you think?
So from my research, the issue is not that there aren't resources. There are many organizations we've heard about the Executive Leadership Council. Another group that I'm familiar with is the Athena Alliance, based out of California, that looks at gender diversity, and certainly companies that are represented here. The issue is not that there aren't pools. The issue is actually the board directors who are selecting the nomination and governance committees and vetting the board members.
And this is something that I want to delve a little deeper about, because we've heard some testimony in this with regard to this idea about those that are interviewing and things. So would having gender, racially, or ethnically diverse interviewers lead to a more successful recruiting process? We've heard about how we need to have candidates that are diverse, but it seemed like a lot of the testimony we received said that interviewers have to have that culture and be diverse in their backgrounds and expertise.
So there's evidence based on recruitment for other positions in companies that having a or having a recruiter who is somewhat similar on some dimension is important.
I think I'm out of time. Anything else that you could send us in that regard, I would very much appreciate. Thank you, Dr. Creary. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, who is also the chair for the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Financial Institutions, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And first, I want to thank you for your visionary work in making sure that in this Congress, we have a D&I subcommittee. It is tremendous work and vision on your part, and I want to thank you very much for doing that. And I also want to thank Chairwoman Beatty, who has been extraordinary as the chair of the committee, and individuals that come before that committee. I hear everywhere when they come before that committee the kinds of questions and how she's holding people accountable to try to make sure that we have diversity in our corporate boards. It is extraordinary at this time that that's happening, and it is because of your leadership, and I want to thank you for that. Let me thank these witnesses. You know, I've been listening to you sitting here intently. You all are tremendous. Many of the questions that I initially was going to articulate or ask, you've covered in your statements. And it is tremendous. I mean, it shows, and even with the ranking members of the subcommittee, Ms. Wagner, and the ranking member of the committee, Mr. McHenry, you know, it just seems that we really need to get at this question of board diversity to make our corporate America reflect our country, and it makes us all better. It's better for business, and it's how to do that. And my colleague from New York, Ms. Maloney, who has a bill, and I have a bill all going. It just shows how we're trying to move in the right direction to get things done. It's tremendous. And so let me ask, because one of the things, I mean, y'all touched on it, because one of the things that have concerned me all the time is the number of folks that get on board. It seems to me, particularly, I think, with African-American males, you get one, and you put that one on every board, and then you say you met your requirement because you had that one person who's on several different boards, and everybody in all of those boards are scoring that one person as their diverse candidate, you know, to show that they have diversity on their board. Now, so I'm trying to figure out, as far as best practices are concerned, what do we do to defeat that? One of the things that, you know, we were thinking about, and I know I had in my bill, was to have the director of the Office of Minority and Women Inclusion to publish, of the SEC, to publish every 3 years best practices for compliance with disclosure requirements, and also to have are we at the SEC to establish an advisory council that includes issuers and investors to advise on best practices. What do we do? How do we do so that we can try to eliminate that? I'll start with Mr. Visconti.
I think if you looked at Congresswoman Maloney's bill and you think about what committees those board members are on, and anybody who's been on a nonprofit board or a board knows that if you're on governance, if you're on the important committees, compensation, you don't have time to serve on many boards. You have time to serve on one or two. So I think identification of who is on what committees in these boards will have its own factor in limiting the number of people who are counted on several boards.
And with the slow turn, same question. Let me go to Mr. Lumborough. Can you add anything to that?
Representative Meeks, I'm happy you raised the issue because I'm a little surprised it hasn't come up yet in the conversation. There's a strong preference for experienced directors. First-time directors, regardless of race, regardless of gender, have a difficult time coming on boards because there's a preference for people that have been there and done that. There's a theme in the room about how best boards are run, egalitarian, inclusive. There's a developmental part of that. We talked about assessment and effectiveness. Having boards that think about how do I bring on a first-time director and mentor that person, teach them how to be a director, et cetera. That's a really important part of the solution to both casting the wide net as well as getting people on the board and making them successful. So that first-time director issue is the one that you've hit on very clearly.
And one of the things that you've mentioned too, and people talked about is it seems as though at times the only folks that they want on board is a CEO or a former CEO, as opposed to other individuals that might have come from the field of technology or others. Even what I think HR, some HR executives sometimes can be the person because they understand the industries and how you better have folks in there. Dr. Creary, in the little time I have, can you comment on that?
Yes, I think we actually do see today, I believe Bed Bath & Beyond is one company that recently overhauled its board and actually does have representatives from some of these more diverse professional backgrounds on it. So there is a move in this direction to expand the capacity of boards to do their work by recruiting people who are from, for example, HR and academia. It just hasn't happened to the extent that we would like to see.
The gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Lucas, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you and the ranking member for holding this hearing today. In one of my other roles in this body in Congress, I am ranking member of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, and we held a hearing on promoting a diverse workforce in science, engineering, mathematics fields. We highlighted the lack of diversity in many STEM fields and how it prohibits the United States from reaching its full economic potential and hinders American competitiveness. It would seem that the same can be said for the diversity in our corporate, lack of diversity in our corporate boards. So I turn my first question to Ms. Gerken. In your written testimony, GAO identifies strategies that stakeholders and corporate boards are currently implementing to increase diversity. Can you elaborate on how some companies are taking steps to prioritize diversity, particularly in diversifying that pool of candidates?
I think one of the common themes that we heard from all of the industry officials that we spoke with is that there are a number of different strategies that can be employed, but what is most critical is that there is a commitment to ensuring greater representation on the board. And so the stakeholders we spoke with talked about a lot of different strategies in terms of looking beyond the CEO pipeline, identifying, being in kind of a continuous recruiting strategy system where as you identify great candidates, you bring them on even if maybe you aren't actually having an active search and have an active opening, or expanding the number of board positions. But the stakeholders we spoke with commented on, while there's a number of great strategies out there, it's that commitment to diversity among the board that was the most effective and important strategy.
My next question, I think I turn to Dr. Creary. You explained in your testimony that even though a board is diverse, the company still may not reap the rewards that diversity brings. Can you elaborate on that challenge for us, please?
Yes, so for example, we have people in my sample who do represent that one African-American board member who is on multiple boards who has commented on the fact that they have tried to raise, for example, issues of diversity, and no one listens. So that's an example of the fact that just by increasing the diversity does not mean we're going to get to the results that we want to, particularly if the result is to tackle issues of diversity in the leadership pipeline.
Lastly, I know this issue exists across industries. And as I mentioned earlier, women are underrepresented in engineering, science, and math fields. To anyone on the panel, how does the diversity of the financial services industry compare across industries? And are there any fields that are leading in their efforts to create a more diverse workforce? How does financial services industry, when it comes to board participation, compare to other boards across different industries? Please.
I had a journalist who reports to me count heads, and the financial services, the top 100 banks are average compared to other industries. The top 10 banks are slightly above average compared to other industries. This is a common problem across the board.
Anyone else wish to address that? Please, Ambassador.
Yes, I was going to add that having served on 2 bank boards that were quite diverse for foreign-owned companies, in fact, one Japanese, the other French, and the regulation is so intense that you actually need quite a diverse skill set among the board directors, and it was an area where the board directors really taught each other whatever it was they brought to the table. So I think that has had a very beneficial impact on that industry.
Absolutely. Anyone else?
To your other question, not about financial services, but in broadly speaking, we're seeing more progress in consumer. Those companies tend to be more sensitive to the marketplace, who they're selling to, what their employee base looks like. So I would say they're inching ahead in terms of this being top of mind.
Thank you. If no one else wishes to address that, I'll yield back the balance of my time, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, who is also the chair for the Subcommittee on National Security, International Development, and Monetary Policy, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me express appreciation to you for this hearing. I was reading somewhere about someplace about criticizing somebody else and you have a plank in your eye. The federal government has a bad record as well. There's a recent article in Politico talking about the lack of diversity in the Department of Treasury, even at a time when they're denying a $20 bill in the memory of Harriet Tubman. So, the federal government, there's some components of our government that are embarrassingly absent of any diversity. Having said that, I am fascinated by this nation's heterogeneity, but I'm frustrated by the homogeneity of the higher ranks of homogenized corporate America. And it's really an issue that we've got to keep up front. I just spent some time with one of these high-tech companies, these new high-tech companies where these billionaires are born every 35 minutes. And I'd go in and the CEO would be 13 and the director of the production was still in the crib and made decisions after he would suck on the bottle. But there were no brown and black babies in the cribs in those places. And I think we cannot have this discussion without discussing the ever-growing high-tech industry and a very, very visible absence of diversity. And I'm wondering if any of you have had any view, based on the things that you are concerned about, of what's going on in the high-tech world and how we can impact them other than maybe starting regulating them and making some requirements. Any ideas on how we can pierce this barrier that's been there with high-tech companies and the lack of diversity?
I would suggest that it's really important to try to get them to link in with K through 12 educators, because in most school districts, they do have magnet schools or similar institutions where they emphasize STEM or high-tech fields, and there are invariably students, and there are many students of color in the public school system. So that linkage, I think, could be made stronger. It exists in bits and pieces here and there, but I think that's a good area to look at.
Yes.
I also want to suggest that I think that there's also issues around unconscious bias as well, too, that is going on in a lot of these areas, especially when you look at the leadership ranks of these high-tech companies. And I think that despite the media's portrayal that Asian men are overrepresented, they are overrepresented perhaps in the early to mid-career levels, but you certainly do not see them in the leadership ranks. But within that, you do see then that the folks who are making these decisions have stereotypes, I think, of what constitutes a good tech worker. And oftentimes, I think that unconscious bias leads to people not necessarily searching out the diverse talent that is out there and is highly capable of working in many of these high-tech companies.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Sheryl Sandberg wrote Leaned In. She was the only woman on the executive committee of Facebook. She's still the only woman on the executive committee of Facebook 6 years later. It doesn't work. The tech industry is the worst in this country, in my opinion, on this subject of diversity. The worst, bar none.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. My youngest son would point at things and say, it's worser. And so I agree that they are worser. But, we've got to figure out a way to penetrate or it's going to get worser. Thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Tipton, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and appreciate you holding this hearing today. Ms. Akutagawa, I'd like to follow up a little bit on Mr. Cleaver's comments in terms of some of the workforce development as well in relation to board diversity. And maybe Dr. Creary, you'd like to be able to comment on this as well. We've had a study that's come out from Glassdoor that found that 2/3 of job seekers said that workplace diversity is important to them when evaluating employees and job offers. Another from PricewaterhouseCoopers found that 61% of women specifically consider diversity of an organization's leadership team in deciding where to be able to take a job. So it's obviously clear that when people are looking for a job, they take in some of the leadership roles, obviously, for where they would like to actually to be able to pursue because they see upward mobility opportunities for them. Would you maybe comment on maybe the PricewaterhouseCoopers studies, the Glassdoor studies? How can that really play a role in terms of helping create jobs for people and opportunities?
Well, I think if you can't see it, you sometimes can't be it. And I think that having that diversity in and amongst the different ranks of a company is going to be highly important. And we're looking at a highly diverse millennial generation that is looking for people who look like them and want to see the opportunities that they too can become someone who's going to be leading a company, someone who's going to be on a board of a company. And I think that with that said, there are lots of different things that companies can continue to do, I think, and that are being done right now. And I would also, just for the sake of the record, I would also encourage consideration of not just corporations, but when you look at all employers, not only the government, but also nonprofits as well too, and higher education institutions. And when you look at the leadership ranks of those areas, also lacking in diverse leaders as well too.
Just a little follow-up on that. Are you starting to see companies starting to alter hiring practices? Still a work in progress?
I think it's a work in progress. And as was said earlier, I think you have certain companies, particularly those that are looking to serve consumers that are diverse. They're certainly much more conscious about that. I think we're also seeing ones in which they do need to have a really deep talent pool that they need to, they're forced to cast as wide of a net, and I think that many of them are discovering that's what they're finding.
Great. Dr. Creary?
Yes, I think this is an important question. Certainly, years of research has told us that people are attracted to places, particularly workplaces, where the people who are there in positions of success mirror somehow their own experience. So it goes without saying, I think all of us in academia, in the government, in corporate America are doing a lot of work to make sure that our positions of power are represented by all people who come from our country. At the same time, what we know is that just because you are given access to the position doesn't mean that you will stay in it. And what is happening in corporate America in many sectors is that people who are being recruited for diversity or for any reason are leaving their positions. For many reasons, they're not having the best experience. And so I think it's important to make sure that when we have this conversation about boards, we understand and learn from the lessons of corporate America and all other sectors, that just concentrating on getting people in the door doesn't mean that we won't have a revolving door. So we need to concentrate on the experiences of people in organizations if we actually want them to stay and contribute meaningfully.
Great. Would you maybe expand, we've talked on this a little bit, but some of the best strategies to be able to expand some of that diversity that are yielding positive results?
Yes, so I think certainly on the workforce side, we have employers at my campus. They come and they visit and they host different sessions for people who are, for example, from underrepresented groups, to introduce them to the company and to introduce them to mentors very early on. So the whole recruiting process is one that is inclusive. If you think about it, some of these practices could actually be used at the board level. It's a courting process, if you will, of helping people to understand that they can be, that is a good fit for them as an individual and that they could be effective. It's not just about, I think for many of our young people today, particularly people at my institution, wanting to go to an organization that's diverse. It's that diversity to them signals opportunity and that someone like them can be successful there. And I think it's important to keep that in mind.
Great. Thank you. My time's expired. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentlewoman from Ohio, Mrs. Beatty, is also the chair of the Subcommittee on Diversity and Inclusion. She's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters. Please excuse my voice today, and thank you to all of the witnesses. This is an exciting and amazing day for me. As Chairwoman of the Subcommittee on D&I want to applaud you for your honesty and for helping us as we shape this vision under Chairwoman Waters. We've talked about a lot today, and what came to my mind was, and the first time I said I'll have to give credit to Skip Spriggs with the ELC, because what he said, if you fish in the same pond all the time, you catch the same thing. So if we are only looking for seated CEOs or COOs when we talk about corporate leadership, putting people in the room, we need a bigger pool. Now, I don't think that we have heard or there's anything that has happened in the past that has gotten us there 100%, or we wouldn't have Chairwoman Waters taking this national, international leadership for everybody in this room and everybody on both sides of the aisle to become a part of history, because that's what's happening today. Now, we talked about the Rooney Rule that started in 2003. Dan Rooney, I believe, had a great idea, chaired the diversity committee for the NFL because it was a start. It at least got people in the NFL talking about what they had not done, and yet they were making all this money on black players. And so we got great results because it wasn't just putting a minority in the interview, it was a qualified, great minority of thought, of gender, of race, and you can have diversity of thought and environment and end up with a black person. And that's what happened. Congresswoman Waters mentioned Raphael Bostic, and thank you. It was about that same time that my legislation, patterned after the Rooney Rule, the Beatty Rule, we went after the Federal Reserve, and we got Raphael Bostic. So my question is to you, Ms. Akuto, Akutagawa, can you tell me how does having a diverse slate of candidates positively impact the outcome of diverse candidates filling the position?
Thanks for asking that question, Congresswoman Beatty. One thing that I want to just bring up is that when you have diverse board members, when you have diverse leaders or executives, I think that there is that perspective that they bring. And one of the things is that sometimes they can always also recognize leadership that may not show up in the normal way. I think that in this country, there is a prevailing perspective of what leadership is supposed to look like. And that if you can't see beyond it, then it may be difficult to then see someone who is diverse, that they too can also.
Okay, to Mr. Lambra, according to your most recent board monitor report, women fill 183 of the 462 open boardroom positions at Fortune 500 companies. However, racially diverse candidates did not seem to get the same gains. Was your company retained to source diverse candidates, or do you know how many diverse candidates were on the slate?
To be clear, do we measure the slates and the amount of diversity on those slates?
Yes.
Indeed, we do. We made a commitment at the beginning of this year that we would, on a global basis in the aggregate, have diverse slates of at least 50% diversity introduced to clients around the world. Okay. What we've discovered in our business, if you have a very few number of diverse candidates on a slate, it's almost a very low probability anyone will be chosen. Okay. If you have an amply diverse slate, then the probability of a diverse candidate being selected is much, much higher. So we've endeavored that.
Thank you. I have one last question that I'm going to ask everybody to say yes or no to. Do you see the relevancy of why many of us, and I've been doing this ever since I've been in Congress, trying to advocate for getting Harriet Tubman, a woman of color, on the $20 bill? Do you see the value when we talk about diversity and inclusion here in this Financial Services Committee? Would you support that initiative? We're going to start with you, Ms. Gergen. It's a yes or no.
I don't think GAO has a position on it, but the symbolism of women in leadership positions.
So is that a yes?
Strategy we saw.
Okay, we need to go. I only have 7 seconds.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Waters. Appreciate the opportunity to have this panel, and I agree with my friends on the other side that this is a good day to have this very broad and good discussion on this topic. Over my years in business, I'm 40 now. I was looking at my college graduation notice. That's a little frightening. But in that time, I've spent a lot of time both in public companies and private companies over that year, and been the C-suite officer responsible for HR in a public company, and then in my own business, I was reflecting on forming it back in 1999, and we had 7 directors, and 3 of those were women, and we had an outstanding outreach across our business on trying to recruit both employees and officers of color, as well as having diverse leadership. So this is an important issue, and I've studied it really even when I was going back to my days at the Treasury Department in the early 1990s working on corporate governance issues. It led me to go to UCLA and become a certified corporate director, and I was a longtime member of the National Association of Corporate Directors. So I'm very familiar with the issues we're talking about today. And I do think this issue that Dr. Cleary talks about, which is a matter of intention, is critical, and that think of the burdens these boards have. Let's look at post-Sarbanes-Oxley corporate America. Let's say we have 11 people. We've got people saying you should have a smaller board, not a bigger board, because it's more in line with Dr. Creary's point of view. We can build cohesion. So we move a board from 15 to 11 now. We want an odd number so we can have not an even vote split, right? So now we're 9 to 11. One of those people has to be a financial expert, according to the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. One's probably the CEO. So now we're down to 6 or 7. Mr. Lumber testified, and Ambassador Martinez did, that we don't have a lot of turnover in those people. Ambassador Martinez herself serves on multiple, I can't remember how many, 4 corporate boards. So now we're down to this turnover issue. So this is a hard job, is my point. So all the people here are working very diligently on it. One way that I think is a good way for corporate America to expand, and I want to thank my friend Joseph Vaughn at the Corporate Diversity and Inclusion Forum for helping me work on this in my district, was our HBCUs. Alma Adams is not here, but she co-chairs our Historically Black College and University caucus here in Congress. It's something I've been very involved in since I was elected to Congress. And I had an HBCU summit in my district, and it was all about bringing all the corporate and philanthropic people in our district to Little Rock and to think about our HBCUs as a very robust recruiting forum for diverse recruiting for corporate business. So, Mr. Lumbra, if I could start with you. Obviously, you're an expert in recruiting and retaining diverse talent, do it for a living for 2 decades. What's your best strategy when you recommend to your clients on that bench strength? You've got a limited number of slots. You've got to build expertise. What's your best, not on employees now, but just stick with corporate governance now. What's your best way to build that bench that you recommend?
So there are a couple of things. You framed up the structure of a board really perfectly in terms of the world we're seeing today. Smaller, tighter. Every seat matters even more. So being incredibly disciplined about what skill set do you need in that seat, really. You need CEOs on the board, but you may not need 7 of them.
Yeah.
You need financial experts on the board. You may need people that do business internationally or know manufacturing or whatever the company's issue.
And you know, 50% of the S&P 500's revenues are international.
Right.
So that's another diverse issue. So let's say if you are an S&P 500 company and you have 50% of your revenue internationally, let's take one of our 9 to 11 slots and say it should be somebody from abroad. Well, we're down another slot. So how do you build those lists for IT, cyber, human resources that are not C-suite people and recommend them for boards? How many are on that list?
Well, first of all, you look for multidimensionality.
Yeah.
You look for people that can do more than one thing. So an example, to use your notion, someone who's grown up in a Fortune 500, that's had international stints, that knows global business, they
Yeah.
may be a woman or minority.
Right.
So you get all of those things you're looking
Good.
for in one person. So research is very, very key, and knowing that market is critical to be able to achieve that.
Well, we want diverse boards that reflect, we want them with the skill sets to have the fiduciary obligations to meet the mission of a board of directors, and we thank all of you for your contributions to better boards. Yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, to the Chair of the D&I Subcommittee for this hearing, and of course to all the panelists who have testified this morning. Walmart is America's largest employer, and according to the firm, 43% of its U.S. associates are people of color and 55% are women. Is the panel aware of the racial and gender composition of Walmart's board of directors? Let me help you. There are 2 people of color and 3 are women. Given the makeup of Walmart's workforce, do you believe that reforming corporate governance laws to include worker representation boards would dramatically increase board diversity? Any one of you.
Regulation's key. Has to be regulated. It's not working the way it is right now, and the impact of a company the size of Walmart on the average American is so outsized, we have a right to be represented on their board and in their senior management, we the people, in our composition. So yes.
Thank you. Anyone else? Ambassador?
I'm going to make the point that mandates are, by definition, very hard to swallow, and I'm sure you're familiar with this phenomenon. So one of the thoughts that has been running through my head as I listen to all of you asking questions and answering them is, you know, you've now heard from people like us here, but what about inviting CEOs to get them to comment on all of the recommendations that your committee has put together? And let's see what they would do with that, because ultimately, they're the decision makers. They're going to hire the Heidrick and Struggles. They each have their own board culture to deal with, and trust me, as a person who's served on lots of corporate and nonprofit boards, every board has its own very distinct culture.
Thank you. Not only do I think that worker representation would enhance gender and racial diversity, I also think that it would result in higher wages for workers. Beginning in the 70s, for example, wages for the average American worker stopped growing in pace with worker productivity, and corporate boards began pursuing the business model that prioritized paying out their shareholders above all other considerations. Boards even began paying their executives more and more through stock, and that led to an increase in stock buybacks, where firms juiced their own stock price by purchasing their own shares on the open market. When firms adopt a shareholder-first mentality, they neglect other considerations: long-term business growth, research and development, and especially worker pay. Yesterday, I introduced the Reward Work Act, which bans stock buybacks and requires that 1/3 of each public company's board be directly elected by its own board. Research shows that wages in countries that require worker representation on corporate boards are 18 to 25% higher than wages in the U.S. For the panel, do you agree that worker representation would help lift wages and get companies to think beyond their wealthiest executives and shareholders? Anyone? If not, I would just close by noting that Walmart has authorized to spend $20 billion on stock buybacks in 2018 and 2019. According to the Roosevelt Institute, if Walmart ended its stocks buybacks and spent $10 billion on increasing wages instead, 1 million low-wage Walmart workers would enjoy an hourly wage increase of $5.66. Moving to another topic, an analysis of Fortune 1000 company boards found that 75% of those companies did not have a single Latino, Latina director. Ambassador Martinez, do you have any insights into why the number of Latino, Latina directors is declining?
It was never very big to start with, unfortunately. And I think, unlike other groups, I'm thinking of women's groups. The women have been very creative, assertive, and they've developed many entry points. And I think this new organization that I'm representing here today is an effort to correct that. It added on to the work of, say, ACER, the Hispanic Association for Corporate Responsibility. I think this new group is going to be very helpful in that effort.
Thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Laudermilk, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you all for being here. It's a very interesting topic. Dr. Curry, I appreciate the research you've been doing, and from what I understand of your research, what is showing as diversity in boards is positive, but it seems to be more so in the diversity of ideas and perspective more than just the demographics of race and gender, et cetera. Does that summarize kind of what your findings have found as more ideas and perspective?
It's not suggesting that one form of diversity is better than another. It's suggesting that when we think about diversity of perspective in addition to thinking about demographics, that's when we actually begin to see, according to the people who I've interviewed, positive effects. So it's hard to say we're not doing that kind of research where we're saying which one is better and which one's contributing to the effect. So I wanted to make sure that that's clear. It's not like a horse race.
Right. Well, sometimes perspective can transcend into gender or different communities because of the needs of different communities or the customers that are in those areas, so I can understand that. One of the things that I was trying to categorize this into different industries, especially in financial services, Georgia has a lot of fintech and payments businesses, and we've seen a significant rise in these companies, and some of the traditional banking, some in the traditional banking industry feel somewhat threatened by these new automated type industries. They feel that they're going to take some of their market share in the future, which very well could be. And it appears to me that it's because they're bringing in people with different ideas outside the status quo, bringing in ideas being innovation, perspective, hitting certain customer bases that traditional banking may not be serving. Do you feel like that's kind of what drives these industries to innovate, is that they do go outside the status quo?
Definitely, but I think the point that you're hitting on here is there's a level of discomfort with diversity. And so if we're trying to explain why there isn't diversity, it's because we have traditionalists who are concerned about what effect that will actually have on their firm. So that's actually the issue we need to address, is help people to understand who are traditionalists, why things need to change. I think at the same time, it's also important to think about the fact that diversity of thought, which is an idea that has captured, I think, the minds of many people in corporate America, is not necessarily the only piece of the story here. When we think about what we're trying to achieve as a board or as a company more broadly, we are actually trying to access talent, and we are actually trying to access markets. And so we do need different types of diversity in order to do that, including the social forms of diversity. So what we're trying to accomplish, I think, through the research on boards and workforces is to put all hands on deck, all forms of diversity on deck, in order to target those two goals around accessing the best talent so that our companies will perform well, and accessing the market so that our company will also, and our economy will perform well as well.
Okay, and I appreciate that. It's when we look at these boards, especially with the technology era we're in, it seems like diversifying on the board to bring in people from different communities than what you would traditionally see in a banking industry or something can bring a perspective from that particular community of needs of those customers. What can companies do to foster this new thought of diversity, of bringing in new ideas and perspectives?
So I have an example for you. So recently, Shaquille O'Neal, famed basketball player, was appointed to the board of Papa John's after Papa John's had some issues with its chairman saying a racial slur on a conference call. And I think many were concerned about Shaquille O'Neal being on this board. What is he going to do? Not knowing that Shaquille O'Neal has been a master investor in fast food restaurants, including 27 Five Guys in the last several years. But he's also somebody who's really connected to the urban community. And I think it's that narrative is helping people to understand, who might not at a surface level see his value, that in fact he actually does have business value, and he actually is connected to this community that you're actually trying to regain or to seek out in your efforts to diversify your market base.
Okay. I see I'm about out of time. It's very fascinating. Thank you for your responses. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Texas, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for bringing this topic to the table. It's one that I have followed for years, and it's very distressing that some of the numbers that we're seeing are not really significant improvements. In fact, they're barely improvements. You know, by way of background to the panel, I served as the elected city controller in Houston. In fact, it was probably my first elected position. And one of the things that always surprised me, that any boardroom that I was invited to, and especially when I ever went to Wall Street for any of the pricings that we did in our bond deals, I was faced with nice-looking white men and dark suits and a red tie maybe, but mostly blue ties. And there was not people that had my Spanish surname or didn't, or like women that looked like me. And it seems like we've not made much progress. And it was really interesting to really look at the handout that you had, Ambassador, that clearly paints the picture of, while the percentage looks like it's improved, the actual numbers are really small. So I just wondered, what is it that's going to take to really get some movement in this direction? I mean, is it going to have to be this legislation? Is it more legislation? I mean, what do we have to do? And I wanted to start with you because it's the only Latina at the table here, and Latinas have the worst record, and of course, all women of color have challenges in this area. What can we do that when we look at diversity, that we look at all of it?
I think what we need to do, and I think you want to focus on Latina, especially diversity, if I understand your question. The Latino Corporate Directors Association is a very new organization. I think they have a very
Right.
important
My office has
role
met
to-
with them.
Yes,
And
you know.
by reference, I was involved with, I said at the very beginning.
Wonderful.
And I attended one of the Harvard programs that was there at the business school.
Yes, so what I think would be really beneficial is for them to grow as quickly as possible and as strategically as possible, but also to leverage the other institutions. And certainly when it comes to women, you know, there's Catalyst, there's Women Corporate Directors, there's so many different organizations. And I know that the Latino Corporate Directors Association has some very strategic plans in its near future in terms of things that they've seen in
But are y'all getting the
California.
meetings with the CEOs that make the decisions on that
I
to
think
be
they're-
able to implement
Yes,
those
I think
strategies?
they-
Because we can have
If
a
you
great
look-
list of things to do, but if we don't have the meetings to effectuate that strategy,
I agree with
they
that.
might as well sit around collecting dust.
Well, when you look at the membership roster, which I was just doing last night, it does seem to me that they have the connections, if you will. And
Okay.
as we all know in this room, it is also much about connections and whom do you know and who trusts you and who's going to vouch for you, who's going to say she's not crazy, she's going to be able to walk in and ask, you know, questions in the proper manner, sort of thing. So that I think that's the way for us to go at this point in time.
Right. Mr. Visconti, I'll follow up with you then. One of the things that I also saw was that there was recruitment sometimes for some of us to sit on what they call community advisory boards, which was really not the board. Is that still happening? Is that just another trick that's played with some of these numbers, or are all these numbers reflective of full board paid memberships?
I'm not an expert in that area, but what I will say is it's accountability that drives home results. So if a CEO or chairman of the board is holding people accountable and firing people who cannot perform, that's when you see the numbers change, without excuses.
Right, Ms. Gerken, and when folks get on these boards, are they being like pigeonholed, if you will, to serve on the committee on community relations or the committee for, you know, I forget what other committee there was, but there were committees that were not the finance committee. It's not the decision-making committees on the major issues impacting those banks.
We actually didn't look at where women and minority board directors, which committees they were on, but one of the strategies that we actually heard was strategically putting women and minority board members on the governance or on the nominating board committee to ensure that they were put into a position of power to increase the commitment to diversity and continue to recruit for more diverse board members. So it's kind of the flip side.
All right, thank you, and yield back, Madam Chair. I think I'm out of
Thank
time.
you. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I thank you all for your devotion to this cause and your efforts to make the public more aware about it and to inform me and my colleagues. And so I want to ask something that hasn't come up yet. And I don't know for sure if any of you are prepared from looking through your comments to address it, but how diverse are our boards in America compared to corporate boards around the world?
May I address that? Because
Please.
when I served as ambassador to Argentina, there are 500 American companies doing business there, and there is an Argentine-American Chamber of Commerce, and I did a lot of work with that chamber. And it was very interesting to me that the Argentine companies really valued the interaction they had with the American companies, and they especially were interested in the American companies' commitment to corporate social responsibility, to professional development of its employees, and they were starting to really look at board composition. In Argentina, I don't know if it has a law with respect to corporate board service per se, but they do have a law with respect to their Congress, that X percentage of the Congress has to be women.
Thank you for
Yes,
that. And so that's one comment. You were quick on it. And I expect that some people would talk about Europe, and they do have a mandate in the European Union for sex, and really male and female, I believe. And here, I haven't heard the word sex used a single time. I've heard gender. So if I could just go down the line, maybe starting with Ms. Gerken, do you differentiate between sex and gender? Just yes or no?
For the purposes of our work, we looked at males and female board members.
Mr. Visconti?
Yes. The phrase gender is the one that's used commonly.
Okay, so no differentiation, you just blur the two?
I haven't used the word sex to describe a board member, so gender is the one that we use commonly. Yeah.
Gender is also the word that we use too.
Gender's been the commonly accepted term used, and I've used it.
Right.
Same.
Same. Okay, so some of the data sets are blurring sex and gender, because we spent a lot of time talking about gender here lately, and you know, the concept of a social construct where biologically male and female are different. So does that kind of diversity matter?
Yes. You know, diversity is diversity, and it takes all shapes and forms. Curiously, some of the diversity that I provided on some of the boards on which I served was political diversity, that I was one of the few Democrats on the board.
So we spend a lot of time on some of our things in the military, talking about this. Does it come up as you know, clearly there's been a difference in the current administration, the past administration, on transgender and transsexual people, but you also have historically looked at sexual difference, male and female, categorically versus gender. So only recently did we start to use gender to differentiate people other than male and female for some of these categories. And so that's my concern on the data set. When you look at racial, ethnic diversity, our country really is different than most of the world. I mean, we have become the melting pot, truly the world's land of opportunity. Everyone around the world has people that are leaving their places and coming to our places. And to be fair, some Americans do leave here and go elsewhere. We have a large expat community. But truly, this is the world's land of opportunity. Our companies flourish, and I would say part of the reason we have flourished is we do actually have diversity in America. And so I'm encouraged by the amount of progress that I've seen in diversity in my lifetime. I know as a kid growing up, you know, first you don't know any difference about anything, and then you see how people treat you differently. And then when you're with one group of friends, you'll see how things happen differently with this group of friends. And when you're in a homogenous group, how things happen differently there. And sometimes that's with peers, sometimes that with people from an older generation, sometimes, unfortunately, that's with people from law enforcement and other communities. With respect to corporations, I think you've done a nice job highlighting some of it. I think we should do more to celebrate how strong the United States of America is, in fact, partially because of our diversity. I yield.
Thank you. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, who is also the chair for the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank the ranking member, thank the witnesses for appearing, and would compliment the chair for hosting this hearing, and acknowledge that the chair is probably the hardest working, maybe I'll just say one of the hardest working chairs in Congress. She sits through these hearings, if you've noticed, and I think that sends a very strong message about the concern that she has, so I compliment you, Madam Chair. Dear friends, I believe that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and as a result, I have a couple of pictures that I'd like to show you. Ambassador Martinez, it's my belief that you have indicated that we should quiz the captains of industry about their circumstances with reference to having persons who are minorities, women.
Well, as a diplomat, I would say invite them for a conversation.
All right.
Yes,
well,
sir.
let me just share this with you. We did that. And I'd like to just share some of the conversation with you. But I did make a mistake when I had this opportunity. I mentioned women, and I mentioned persons who are of color, but I did not mention LGBTQ. I think we have to be inclusive in all ways. I don't think we can leave out any segment of society. So with that as my confession, I posed a question to captains of industry, the heads of major lending institutions. Their names need not be made available at this time, but I'd like to show you this picture, because in this picture, with these captains of industry, you'll note that they are all seated and looking quite like the captains of industry they are. They all happen to be white men, all white men. I found that to be something worthy of noting at the hearing, and I did. But I posed a question to these captains of industry, all of whom are white men. You ought not be afraid to state facts. There are some people who don't want to hear me say white men, but you have to state facts. These were all white men, captains of industry. The question that I posed was one that dealt with their successors. If you believe that your successor is likely to be a woman or a person of color, raise your hand. This is the response. Raise your hand. Not one hand. Captains of industry, brilliant people all. Not one hand. Well, understanding that maybe that was just a circumstance for the immediate future, I then posed the question to all of these white men. Remember, we cannot avoid facts. I then said, in the next 10 years or decade, are you likely to have a woman or a person of color to succeed in your position? 1, 2, 3, 4 hands, 5 hands. But notice, 2 of the captains of industry are indicating that in the next 10 years, they're not likely to have a woman or a person of color. That's why I'm so grateful that the chairwoman is having this hearing. We have to be concerned about not only the lending that takes place in these institutions, but the leadership that takes place in these institutions. There is no empirical evidence to support the fact that doesn't exist, a fact that women, members of the LGBTQ community, and people of color, no empirical evidence supporting a notion that they cannot lead these organizations. There is none. We're beyond that old premise that we can't find any that are qualified. They are capable, competent, and qualified persons, and we have to change the circumstance. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gonzalez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this important hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for your participation. One of the things I'm most proud of and enjoying the most in my time in Congress is my time on the Diversity and Inclusion Subcommittee here inside of the Financial Services Committee. Congresswoman Beatty, who spoke earlier, is doing a phenomenal job, as is Ranking Member Wagner, and just can't be more appreciative of that, and I know the chair is largely responsible, so I thank her. Another thing that I work on a lot is diversity and inclusion inside of STEM fields on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, as was mentioned earlier. And I will tell you, of all the work that I'm doing here in Congress when I'm back home, which is the Cleveland area for me, when I'm back home in Northeast Ohio, the work we're doing here is probably that which folks are most excited to talk about. Key Bank in particular, which is in many branches in my district, is doing a great job. I think, Mr. Visconti, you may have cited them in your testimony. So I'm really pleased that we're having this hearing. Dr. Creary, I want to kind of turn to you for my question, my first question. You talk a lot in your testimony about the difference between hierarchical and egalitarian board structures. And it's not diversity, just a check-the-box form of diversity that drives business performance, but really it's how you conduct yourself in the board environment. How are those studies going, and are you finding direct causal relationships between the egalitarian version of a board meeting versus the hierarchical?
So we are not yet to the place of where we can establish causality. So the report that I shared was recently published on March 27th, and that's as far as I've gotten.
Got it.
We have conducted a larger survey, although it's been extremely hard, as you can imagine, to get board directors to participate. We do have about 100 board members who've participated in that, and so we're looking at analyzing the data, which will only establish correlational effects, which is essentially what we have to deal with at this time. I think it's not easy in general to do science, and certainly on this population, I think they're busy, but also there's a lot of concerns around anonymity and confidentiality. So while I would love to have these answers, and I'm sure we all would, it goes a long way to say that even getting 20 people to participate is good information.
How could we, so you said we can't, right now the best we can do is the correlation component as opposed to the causation. What's holding us back? How could we get to causation?
It requires a critical mass of people participating, and there's a
data pool
study
needs to be
design, there's a lot of, we need data, we need lots of data. Yeah.
Got it. Well, I encourage you to keep pushing forward on that. It's a great initiative, certainly. Dr. Martinez, I'm a son of Cuban immigrants. My father immigrated here from Cuba in 1960. And when I'm home and I'm speaking to the Latino community specifically, in many instances they feel left behind, like we're not getting the attention that we deserve back in the community. Are you seeing that, yes or no? And if you are, what can we do to make sure we're more inclusive of the Latino community as well?
Get involved. Just stay involved as you are, and encourage others to do the same. There's no substitute for involvement at whatever level interests you. You are especially interested in the STEM issues and diversity and inclusion, but education is going to be such a key, and there are more and more Latino advocacy groups near you in Cleveland, and to get involved with all of them.
Thank you. And for my final minute, I want to turn to Mr. Visconti. You had one part of your testimony that I thought was interesting, to say the least. You said the NFL is a de facto plantation. I have some experience there. I played in the NFL, played for 5 seasons. I think that's patently false, first of all. But let me ask you a question. Have you ever watched the NFL draft? You ever watched it?
No.
Never? No. Okay, so just to kind of catch you up, the way it typically works, you're sitting there for hours, and if you're lucky, your name gets called. And typically what happens is you see a scene where family is all around the individual. This is my own story. Family's all around the individual, and it is a joyous celebration. Normally the individuals cry, or they're giving hugs to whomever it is, because it is a joyous occasion. It is literally the fulfillment of a lifetime of work and dedication. The average salary in the NFL is over $1 million, $1 million average salary. This gives people an opportunity to take care of their family and a community in a way that they've never imagined. And I think words are really important, and how we label things is really important. And to call the NFL a plantation, which evokes the worst original sin of our past as a nation, I think is false, and I hope you will correct the record.
May I respond?
I yield back.
The gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I would like to allow you to respond.
What do you describe a system where almost 100%, except for one person, of owners are white, and 70% of the players who earn those people their money are black? It's called a plantation, and that's what it is.
Could I get 30 seconds?
No, I reclaim my time. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for, I love it because I have a chairwoman that believes in and allowing especially women of color to have access and a voice in this committee. I do want to tell you a story. So when I first decided to run, it was like in February of last year, and there was a woman who comes up to me. She's Palestinian like me. She also shares my faith, Muslim faith. And she kind of just like hugs me and looks at me and she said, you have to win. And of course the pressure, and I said, well, we've already won. The fact that I'm running as is, as proudly Palestinian Muslim, as a woman, and all of these, important identifiers to me. And I, paused and I look at her and she goes, no, you don't understand. You have to win, because if you win, that means we belong. And it was a powerful moment, because I thought to myself, as I was running, it was for me fighting against corporate greed, the fact that I represent the third poorest congressional district and I wanted to fight back. But to me, I understood there was so much more of me being in this space. And it is very telling of why this committee hearing is so important. And one of the things that I remember in the nonprofit sector is foundations would ask us the makeup of our board. When we applied for grants to combat poverty, want to make sure that the nonprofit, boards and the folks that are serving those communities reflected the community. And I'm wondering, in the corporate world, like if I go to Walmart's website, if I go to these corporation websites, am I going to get that chart that many of these foundations ask these nonprofit agencies to do, the chart that said, this is how many women, this is how many African Americans, Latino, all those, I think, important factors. Do you see a move and some corporate responsibility in sharing that on their websites and very publicly? And I would like each of you to have time to answer that.
We actually didn't look to see if the information was available on their websites, but we did look and we talked to a number of industry officials about sharing that information with their investors. And a number of industry officials said that the most powerful force of change is the demand of investors and shareholders to see increased levels of diversity on their board.
Yeah.
It should be there, but it's not. More and more, you're seeing boards being pictured and executive leadership being pictured, and I think that's a very positive step in the right direction. You could look on the company's own website and see who they position as leadership. Very important.
In my experience, it's uneven. Some companies it's quite easy to find out, and you can see, and others you have to do some research, so it's not consistent.
Yeah, someone who looks at a lot of this, it is inconsistent, but I also want to say that someone who's also looking a lot at nonprofits and foundations, they're not showing their data either, and that's why, especially the bigger ones, the power dynamic there is a lot different. So,
I have the same experience as Ms. Akutagawa. Yeah.
I just want to remark that the question earlier, the comments earlier came about, were we inferring gender and sex and using those interchangeably? We have a long history of doing research in academia that's inferring gender and sex and making conclusions about its effect on anything, including board performance, based on the pictures that we've seen. So it would be interesting to know that if we actually started asking people about their gender identity, how would any of these effects pair out?
Yeah, no, it's important. And lastly, one of the things that, and then again in the nonprofit sector, we did these diversity trainings. What is diversity training to you all? Because some of the trainings I've gone through, to me, they were not diversity. I mean, can you shed some light into that? And I just want to get it on the congressional record for this committee. I think there needs to be a discussion about what is defined as that people easily put diversity in front of something and say that's the diversity training, diverse board, and it's not reflective. Please.
When Starbucks got into trouble, they decided they could fix their whole issue in 6 months. It's going to take them 4 years to get rid of plastic straws. It's garbage, most diversity training.
No, thank you so much, and I yield the rest of my time, Chairwoman.
Thank you. The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and I would like to yield to the gentleman from Ohio, my friend, Mr. Gonzalez.
Thank you. So, Mr. Visconti, you mentioned the Rooney Rule as a failure, and I want to just kind of go through some stats. So from 1921 to 2003, there were 7 minority coaches, 1921 to 2003. 2003 to the present, 18. So I think Broadly, the NFL is like most of society, in my opinion. It's imperfect. There's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of progress still to be made. But to deny the opportunity that's created for the families and the athletes and call it a plantation, again, I think words matter. I think we can talk about this and talk about the progress that we need to make, and that will be a healthy, productive dialogue, which I think has been the case for 99% of our time here in this hearing today. But I think we need to be very careful with how we're labeling things. And that's all I want to say. But with that, I'll yield to my friend, Mr. Barr.
Thank you, and I appreciate your perspective, your personal perspective with the NFL. Not many of us have had the privilege or the talent to play in the NFL, and I trust people with personal experience, and I appreciate your perspective. So the good news is that the number of Fortune 500 companies with boards that consist of more than 40% women and minorities has doubled since 2012, and I think we can all celebrate that and increased progress in diversity. Dr. Creary, can you speak to the recent trends regarding the diversity of boards, and what factors have contributed to that improvement over the last few years?
Yeah, it's a great question. So certainly, I think many would characterize the first wave of focusing on the business case for diversity. And we were there for a very long time just trying to establish some semblance of a relationship between the composition of a board and outcomes for the firm. We've moved recently in the past 5-10 years into a wave of, I would say, peer pressure, where institutional investors and asset managers are beginning to understand not only that this is important, but they actually have to engage in peer-to-peer tactics to help boards understand that this is an important issue. So I would say that's where we are now, is pressurizing boards to begin to take the responsibility for allowing all of the investment that we've done in research and in practice to actually be realized.
Dr. Creary, were any of the factors since 2012 in terms of enhanced diversity, were any of those factors government-imposed diversity mandates?
So this would be where the corporate arena is actually leading in implementing practices without regulations. Certainly when you think about the evolution of the diversity and inclusion conversation in corporate America, their only mandates right now in the US is to engage in strategies that say that they're looking. And so much of the work that's been done has been done because firms have taken the responsibility, certainly with pressures from outsiders, to engage in this work.
Well, there obviously is evidence that board diversity can enhance company competitiveness and profitability, and that the market itself is rewarding diverse firms. My final question to you, Dr. Creary, is I was very impressed with your testimony about the importance of culture and the fact that you might have tokenism is not real meaningful diversity. It's more about boards actually utilizing the diversity, utilizing those diverse views as opposed to just superficial, what I would say is superficial diversity. I am concerned, and I'd like your feedback, that government-imposed diversity quotas, as opposed to these market-based incentives, would actually contribute more to tokenism, would contribute more to a superficial diversity, as opposed to that culture that you describe in which people are valued not based on the color of their skin or their gender or their sexual orientation or immutable characteristics or their age, but actually the content of their character, actually things that matter like their talent, like in the NFL, where it's really not about your race, it's about your talent. Can you win the Super Bowl? Can you catch the pass? Can you score a touchdown? I could not do that. My friend could. And so to me, a government-imposed quota on racial diversity within the NFL is really not ultimately what matters. What matters is raising a trophy over your head. What matters is profitability. And so what I would worry about is not having a right culture, but imposing artificial diversity. And I yield back.
Gent is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair Lady. First of all, this is a very powerful and much needed hearing. And secondly, we have some very informed witnesses. And thirdly, Madam Chairlady, you're providing great leadership on a very important area. Now, there are right now only 3 black CEOs running Fortune 500 companies. And that is down from 8 just 3 years ago. The number of women serving as CEOs went down 25% from 2017 to 2018. I discussed this issue at a hearing a couple of weeks ago on diversity with the need to get financial literacy. And I think it is very important that we continue to raise this point. Those are the facts. That's the picture out there right now. Some can run, but they surely cannot hide from just 3 African American CEOs, down from 8 just 3 years ago, and a decline in women over the last year by 25%. Now, Mr. Lumbrough, given that there are so few women and African Americans represented at the CEO level, how can board diversity increase more than marginally if boards do not expand their search pools beyond the CEO ranks? In other words, if you're truly after doing this, there are so many areas to reach into. I did a lot of recruiting in my day. I worked for a while for a firm called Recruiting Management Consultants. When we went out and we would help major corporations, because it's one thing to tell the corporations to do this, and if you don't develop a mechanism to help them go find where these African American qualified women are, they quickly will come back and tell you, you know, we tried, but we just couldn't find them. They didn't have any plan to do that. And so I wanted to get from you, Mr. Lam, am I right about that? I mean, there were opportunities, there were other areas. We would go and take advantage of the fine training and executive talent, decision-making, and understanding how to handle pressure by looking at former military officers. A lot of that is still done, who had command over huge numbers of people, risky at the time, having the capacity of sending huge numbers into war. There are a lot of places you can go to find that. So am I right about that, Mr. Lumbrough? Would you? I think you mentioned that in your deal.
In my experience, you are right. The fact of the matter is, and you said it beautifully, if you focus on sitting Fortune 500 CEOs, by definition, you do not have a diverse pool to look at. The talent that is senior, sophisticated, coming out of the military, out of academia, people who've been in service firms, who have run big businesses for big corporations, it's much, much more ample. So in our experience, clients that have the courage to go and look and the discipline to look in those pools much, much more easily and readily find diversity for their boards. The other point you make is an important one, which is who makes decisions about CEOs? Boards. So if we're concerned about diverse CEOs, we should be concerned about diverse boards who are choosing the next CEO and thinking about succession planning. And that's another benefit and a plus for having a diverse board to look further down the chain at a succession plan in a company.
Absolutely. We must expand our territory if we're going to expand the number of African American and women as CEOs and on the boards. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Stiles, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for bringing today's hearing together. I've served at 2 large companies, one a publicly traded company, spent time advising in the boardroom and understand the importance of diversity in the boardroom and the value that that can add to our corporations. I want to ask a question, Dr. Creary. In an article entitled, When and Why Diversity Improves Your Board's Performance, you wrote about how boards should expand their view of diversity and how they can make the most of diversity's benefits. Can you comment on how companies can successfully build more meaningfully diverse boards with avoiding, I think your phrase is tokenism?
Yes, so I think it's certainly about, first of all, having criteria for what an effective board member does and who they should be, and then hiring people or recruiting people onto the board according to those criteria. That would require the board actually understanding and interrogating itself to know what makes for an effective board member based on what makes for an effective board. And I know this sounds pretty rudimentary, but that in fact is the issue that we heard coming up with time and time again, is people are being picked or recruited for board positions based on arbitrary criteria, like having been a CEO or CFO. But when pressed, there isn't a lot of understanding as to why that's the most effective board member. So I think it's about establishing criteria, holding to those criteria, assessing for skills and expertise is really would move us in a good direction.
I appreciate that. And then I'd like you to contrast that approach with what we've seen from several European countries that have enacted requiring public company boards to have a certain percentage of female or of other diverse groups. And you've written about the importance of fostering a board culture that encourages more diversity and collegiality. Could you comment on how these politics impacted board cultures in the countries in which those types of policies have been enacted?
So unfortunately, I can't comment on that particular issue. What I can say is that outside of the U.S., there are actually more and more boards. I think we're up to 17 now that are actually following the European way of mandating required representation on boards. We really haven't done the research to understand how that's working, other than it's actually getting them diversity. So the end, if we think about what is happening, we're increasing diversity, but we don't know what the diversity is actually doing, is sort of where we're stuck.
Thank you. Maybe I'll go back then and note back in your previous article that I referenced that you wrote that to make more diverse boards more effective, you need to have a more egalitarian culture. What are some of the key strategies that companies employ to benefit the most from diversity and foster an egalitarian culture?
So it goes back to this CEO who was hired by the board themselves. So having a CEO who understands that the most effective way to run the board, I say CEO, but I also mean chairperson or lead director, the person who was actually leading the meeting, having them understand that the process of eliciting perspectives from different people in the room is really one of the most important strategies that can be put in place to change the culture of what's happening in the boardroom.
Thank you very much. I thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for holding today's hearing on this important topic, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to all of you who are here today. I apologize for being between 2 committees here, fortunately on the same floor, but don't mistake my in and out for an indifference toward this issue. I'm pleased to be on the subcommittee for diversity and inclusion. And I held a roundtable at my office in the district. I'm from suburban Philadelphia, so hello, Dr. Cleary from UPenn. And it was really fascinating. It was people from government, it was people from law, it was people from education, from industry, just all over the nonprofits, all over the board. And it was fascinating to hear the conversation because we prize diversity, we know it's the right thing, we know it's good for business and organizations. Here are quick takeaways that I had, and I'd love any one of you to comment on some of them. Education was number 1, from pre-K on. We have to have quality education and expose young people to multiple careers from an early age. High school is a great time, but man, oh man, we ought to actually be showing them in the early years and in the middle schools. Career exposure. Relationships and mentorships, apprenticeships, those kinds of things are so invaluable. In my Montgomery County, we have pockets of real need and pockets, for example, our county seat, Norristown, has a very big school system, but they don't have enough resources to see some of these opportunities. In the hiring piece, one of the things that one of the educators said, superintendent said, make sure that the people who are sitting there doing the hiring are diverse, because otherwise they kind of just relate to people that look like them or have their similar backgrounds. Very obvious, but really important. In seeking resumes, don't just seek from the ordinary pool, pull from institutions or other partnerships that you've grown. Look for non-traditional backgrounds, and don't call experience the first thing. I heard one of you talk about the idea that people keep rising to the top because they have previous experience. Make sure that we're giving people the opportunity for experience. One of the most important things, and maybe I'll end with this, and there were so many others, one of the most important things was a woman who's lead public defender in Montgomery County, now in Philadelphia County, African-American woman. And she said, when I became the head of the department, there was no leadership training. So there I was. I had reached that level. But how do we retain leaders? We need leadership training. So I say all of that to say when organizations figure out that they've got a gap in diversity, what are some of the most important key takeaways that as they set their goals that we should know about? And maybe it has to do with, if you could focus a little bit on the notion of leadership training. Maybe I'll start with, pardon me, let me look at the names. Mr. Visconti as an executive search.
That's
Oh, I'm sorry.
Lumbra.
Let me start with Mr. Lumbra, and then I'll go to Mr. Visconti.
The developmental pieces, I loved your analog with the person in Montgomery County in the role had in the training. One of the challenges that we're seeing in leadership development, our executives are being trained to be leaders, not being trained to be directors. Giving them exposure to governance before they're ready to go on a board helps create a board-ready pipeline for diverse talent. And that's one of the things we're talking about today is how do you build that pool, and a pool of people who are to go become board-ready. So effectiveness in terms of training and developing executives to be ready to go on boards is really important, something we're part of.
And is it something that you do in a sustained way, that once somebody gets to that kind of a position that you stay with them, or you have places where they can go for different kinds of training?
There are a multitude of ways. Some educational institutions like Wharton and Stanford and Harvard and others, other firms like ours who are involved in that. Some boards have great onboarding and development programs themselves to help their own executives and their own boards and new directors to become effective.
Okay. And Mr. Visconti?
Leverage what he said, it's accountability for failure of process that matters in making progress. And to give an example, PricewaterhouseCoopers was the first Big Four accounting firm to have a non-HR person in charge of diversity. When that person, a senior partner in the firm, rolled off of that job, he became responsible for the committee that took people who were accountants and made them partners. And when he would come to they would have a board meeting, and people's files would be on the screen. When he'd come to a person, and he said it was most likely a non-white person or woman who didn't have the right experiences to be promoted to partner, he would stop the meeting, call up that person's boss and say, why didn't Kathleen have the right experiences? Her file is in front of this committee, and she's not ready. You're her boss. Why didn't it happen? That changes the conversation when there's accountability from the top.
That's great. And Dr. Creary, in your research, we talk about diversity, and sometimes, oh my goodness, so sorry, time lapsed. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And before I enter my main line of questioning, there are just a few things I would like to clarify from some statements made across the aisle. One, there was some odd and bizarre comments made about sex and gender, and I just want to clarify. Are transgender candidates for corporate boards welcome and celebrated and included as part of diversity on your board? I'll just go down the line, yes or no.
Yes, that would be within the definition of diversity.
Mr. Visconti?
Yes, it would.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. We didn't ask.
Okay, thank you. I just want to make sure that was clarified. Secondly, there was some conversation here about the NFL, and One of my colleagues across the aisle said the NFL is like most of society. And I would actually agree with him, because the NFL is where white billionaires govern the majority of power, and women and people of color work for them and give them their margins. Mr. Visconti, would you say that that's what you were getting at?
It goes even further because the players get to get their brains beaten in and have long-term health care problems that are not covered by the billionaires.
Right, and also, like, when we say the NFL is like most of society, we were talking about average wages and average salaries. If the average is $1 million, right? Well, maybe that's because the highest paid player, Aaron Donald, has signed a 6-year contract for $135 million, and the lowest paid, one of the lowest paid first-year rookies is $480,000. So we get to claim that salaries and appear as though salaries are much higher than what is lived and enjoyed by the majority of people. Would you say that's correct?
And it's a short lifespan as a career, too.
Okay. Thank you, and I'll move on to my main source of questions. So we're here talking about corporate boards, and to clarify and recenter, corporate boards, would you say, Ms. Martinez, are the main source of governing power over a given corporation, correct?
Yes, I would say that. They're legally the main power, yes.
And so who sits on a corporate board? Corporate boards have power, predominant power over a company, and we're talking about massive companies as well, Walmart, McDonald's, et cetera. And so would it be fair to say that who sits on the board is who has large-scale power in a company, in a corporation?
Yes, I would say that's true. And in the past, and I've been privileged to have served on a corporate board starting in 1983, so I've seen some evolution there. Mm-hmm. And when I first went on a corporate board, it was basically the friends of the CEO, people who knew each other. Over time, the concept of board assessment came into play. And that plays a very important role, because it goes to Dr. Creary's point about, what does this board really need? So there are changes that have taken place and continue to take place.
Thank you. And I find that fascinating that even in your experience, corporate boards were more of a friends and family situation. So if you were a CEO, you could put your friends and family in strong decision-making powers, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. And so really this is about power. And so if a board is predominantly wealthy people, then it's wealthy people who have power in our private sector governance structure. If it is predominantly men, then it's men who have economic power. If it's predominantly white people, then it's white people who have economic power in decision-making over a company. And in fact, in the first 6 weeks of 2019 alone, the Walton family of Walmart made $14 billion in 6 weeks with a B after its corporate board artificially inflated the price of its stock by authorizing buybacks. And the practice is extraordinarily controversial, but a lot of people believe that in making $14 billion, especially while paying its workers poverty wages, this could end if workers actually had power, if workers sat on corporate boards. Mr. Visconti, if you could guess, what would McDonald's or Walmart's corporate board look like if its board actually reflected the workers? What percentage do you think it would be women and people of color?
It would be the appropriate percentage.
And if you could just take a stab at it, I know you may not have the number right in front of you, but if you could guess, what percentage of of women and people of color would make up McDonald's board?
Majority of the seats would be women and/or people of color.
Mm-hmm. I have a figure here, 73%.
Doesn't surprise me.
McDonald's board would be 73% women and people of color if it actually represented the workforce that makes up its company. Thank you very much.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Been listening back in my office. Much of what needs to be said here has already been said. If we have boards that are diverse, that will inspire young people to seek the highest positions in the corporate world. It will lead to better corporate governance because we will have boards that can understand the market that they are focused on, understand their workers, understand society, and I think that that information about board diversity is going to be relevant to investors because a company that has diversity on its board is probably a better long-term bet. So, but we should also keep in mind that while officers of a corporation have power, directors have power, the ultimate power is with the shareholders. And if a corporation doesn't meet shareholder needs, either the board will be replaced or more likely the company will be acquired. Because if shareholders don't bid high for the stock compared to the value of the company, some other company will be able to buy them inexpensively. So ultimately, the power is with the shareholders. There are two other elements of diversity that I don't think have been discussed much here, although I think our colleague from New York brought up the importance of having labor leaders and representatives of workers on the board. Did any of the witnesses address the desirability of having a leader from one of the unions that represents workers from a particular corporation being on the board? I know that's required in some European countries. If those witnesses that want to address that with supplemental material should do that. And then the second issue on diversity is people with disabilities. I wonder whether any of the witnesses has in the materials they've submitted or otherwise has a comment on including people with disabilities on the board. Yes, the gentleman who raised his hand.
I'm vice chair of the National Organization on Disability. The chair is Governor Tom Ridge, so there can be Democrat and Republican agreeing and having conversations on this subject. But absolutely, people with disabilities are the highest number of percentage of unemployed people in this country with college degrees. It's a travesty that they stay at home and are not productive in our society and have the fulfillment of the individual desire to go to work and accomplish something. So yes, it would be absolutely a very positive move to count heads of people with disabilities on boards.
And it would make sense as we take these steps with regard to gender diversity and ethnic and racial diversity to also report on persons with disabilities.
Yes, sir.
Does anyone else on the panel have a comment on that? Yeah, Dr. Creedy.
Yes, I want to comment on both of the questions because I think it's an important one about having workers represented. So this is not the same as a union representation, but I will tell you that we're having a challenge just getting the Chief Human Resources Officer represented on a board. And those arguably are people in organizations who know a lot about talent. And so I would say the reason why it's not coming up is because the pushback against having anyone other than a CEO or a CFO represented is very strong. So it makes it very hard to even talk about unions being represented, but also human resources being represented. To the point around people with disabilities, I think for us, it's the same question of LGBTQ. What we know is we are not in a place yet, particularly in America, where we can ask these questions without fear of repercussions for the individuals we're asking to check boxes. So as researchers, one of the things that we're cognizant of is that these are not protected classes in the same way that women and minorities are. So we can do research a lot more confidently on women and underrepresented minorities because we have some semblance of how to handle issues of discrimination in that process. We do not have the same provisions or the same protections for people who are LGBTQ, so it makes it really hard to want to invite those questions for the sake of the people on the other side who are being asked to answer that question.
So if I can have 10 more seconds? Apparently not. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Adams, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters and Ranking Member McHenry for convening this timely hearing. I've been running back and forth chairing a committee, so I apologize. I do want to thank Chairwoman Beatty and Ranking Member Wagner for their leadership on diversity and inclusion. As many of your testimonies have outlined, making an investment in diversity and inclusion is not only the right thing or the moral thing to do, it makes good business sense. Companies and organizations function more effectively, experience increased productivity and greater profitability. When I first came to Congress, I was concerned about the lack of focus on historically black colleges and universities, so I launched the bipartisan HBCU caucus. We've been focused on raising national awareness, educating members of Congress, and increasing federal investments in these schools. So when I met with companies and financial institutions, I always tell them, if HBCUs are not a part of the industry's diversity and inclusion strategies, that you're not doing it right. So I look forward to this particular panel. For each of you, with such overwhelming evidence around the financial benefits of investments in racial and gender equity, why has it still not been achieved across the board? And why are companies still struggling with, or in some cases, resisting diversifying and building inclusive workplaces and boards? So I'm going to open that up to any of you want to answer. Yes, Mr. Visconti.
I would say there's, in some cases, a benign neglect of the reality of our demographics and who's graduating from universities, and in some cases, it's overt racism and sexism.
Okay, would anyone else like to comment? Yes, sir.
We've talked about a few things today. One is the need to look outside of traditional networks. One is the need to have turnover and think carefully about what's needed on boards and use that turnover to bring on diverse contemporary talent.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask Mr. Visconti and Mr. Lumbra, in your observations of companies and organizations that are doing D&I effectively, what are they doing to ensure their boards are diverse?
A couple examples that jump to mind. Intentionality is really important. To take a close look at the board, to look at what the company needs, what are the challenges, what's the strategy, and to find directors who can address those issues. If you do it with purpose, you will find terrific, diverse talent. Worked with a company in Washington recently. The last 4 directors, all women, 2 minorities. Worked with a company in the Midwest, the last 3, 2 African Americans, 1 woman, all fitting exactly what those companies need. So this is achievable, but it takes intention and purpose to get there.
Yeah, Mr. Visconti?
I would tell you that the CEOs we deal with, and we don't deal with boards, we deal with CEOs. They are supported by boards that provide a support to the CEO, emphasizes diversity and inclusion in a measurable, accomplishable way. So the boards that are already supporting their CEOs and making progress on this subject tend to be very diverse boards, and that's borne out in the data that's on our website about the top 10, the top 50, the S&P 500, Fortune 500. It is a purposeful intent of top leadership.
Great. So more specifically, what are the best practices that every organization could implement right now to begin meaningfully building an inclusive workforce? Yes, go ahead, Mr. Visconti.
Structured mentoring that is measured and accountable so that people who are working their way up the corporate chain of command have the tools and learn the ropes that they need to be successful. Resource groups where people with disabilities, Black people, Latinos, can get together and share good ideas and business process and business information. That's very important. And then Executive Diversity Council.
Okay, I want to hear from the lady.
Yes, and the Latino Corporate Directors Association endorses the Improving Corporate Governance Through Diversity Act, which would require public companies to disclose data based on self-identification of the racial, ethnic, and gender composition of their boards of directors, nominees for their boards, and corporate officers.
Okay, great. I've got a few more seconds. What role do boards play in helping to develop the strategy for the organizations?
Accountability.
All right. Anybody else? One word would be good.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's really them holding the CEO's feet to the fire on that.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay. All right. Madam Chair, I'm going to yield back. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to thank all of our distinguished witnesses for their testimony today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written materials or questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you're able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.